Chapter 798. Bastard, Duke Marcus. If you had such power, why didn't you? The Sun King was interrupted by Duque before he could finish roaring. Duque did not hide the disgust on his face. Do you want to ask why I didn't inform you when I discovered the Calamity Army's movements? Or do you want to ask why I didn't come to Kuel Salus like a plaything to help you block the Calamity Army? Wake up, the glorious era of the High Elves is long over. The Sun King was speechless. The so-called politicians, even if their hearts were filled with filth, would always be like a spring breeze on their faces that were full of acting skills. Now that Duke did not care about politics at all, he did not care about the rules in the field of politics. Instead, he felt that he was at a loss for what to do. Most of the High Elves in the distance could not hear their conversation. Of course, this did not include the strongest ranger generals. The clever Lord Themar had obviously thought about why the human allied forces had appeared at such a precise time. However, how could they blame Duque? How could they vent their anger on the alliance? From the secret notification and warning to the official visit of Duke Bolvar, the alliance had not only extended an olive branch, but also sent an olive tree over. But what did the Sun King and the Silvermoon Council do? Other than playing some dirty little schemes to trick Servana's back, it could be said that he had done nothing at all. The High Elves, especially the Rangers, were grieved by the filth and corruption of those in power. This was not just a year or two. It had been like this since the Troll War 2,800 years ago. It was just that the peaceful years had covered up this filth. Now, when the chaotic times came, the seemingly powerful Kuel Salus showed its corruption and weakness time and time again. The blindly superstitious large area defense spell formation was broken without any use. The first time, it was modified by Ghoul Dan into the Storm Altar and produced twin-headed ogres to fight the High Elves. The second time was even worse. Even the magic of the Well of the Sun in the veins had been used, and the violent energy flow had destroyed more than half of Silvermoon City. If it weren't for Duque and the Alliance's fleet, not only would Kuel Salus have been completely destroyed, but even less than 10% of the millions of elves would have survived. Lord Themar and Hageron looked at each other. They saw the same thing in each other's eyes, anger towards the Sunstrider royal family and the Silvermoon Council, as well as an unparalleled desire for reform. It was impossible for Duque to notice their little thoughts, nor did he have the time to care about such a small matter. He focused all his attention on the Sun King because the Great Lich was ready to fight with all his might. The soul punishment from Arthas was getting sharper and sharper. The once mighty Sun King bent his back in pain and let out a heart-wrenching scream. He was painfully and indignantly aware of what it meant to be unable to please either side. Facing Arthas, he had no power to resist. From the moment he volunteered to become a Great Lich, he was destined to be a tool of the fallen prince. Just like those rotten zombies and pale, rotten ghouls, they were just tools. The crown that still rested on his head was only a final fig leaf. Facing Duque, he also felt a sense of helplessness. Being able to control 2 of the 12 different powers of the Well of the Sun at the same time was beyond imagination. Yet, Duque could still maintain his leisurely manner. Perhaps outside, he could casually beat up Duque 10,000 times. But at this moment and place, Duque was almost invincible. Damn it, how can a short-lived human like you understand the benefits of eternity? You won't understand. You short-lived ghost. The Sun King was already a little out of control. Sensitively aware of the flaw that the Sun King had inadvertently revealed, Duque decided to take the opportunity to expand this flaw. With a faint smile on his face, he replied slowly, "Idiot. Even the eternal life blessing that the World Tree brought to the Night Elves was bestowed by the Red Dragon Queen, Alexstrasza. As the great hero who saved Alexstrasza, do you think I don't have eternal life?" Duque spoke in the whisper of wind. Other than the designated target, the 2 windrunners could also hear the whisper of wind. Lilith didn't feel anything. But after Sylvanas heard it, she blushed at the thought of that possibility. Of course, Anastrian wouldn't notice the reaction of a mere female ranger. He was completely shocked by Duque's reply. It was as if a bolt of lightning had descended from the 9 heavens and suddenly struck his forehead. Elata Sinolii, this was the most vicious elven curse that good children didn't need to understand. It contained the deepest resentment of the Sun King, which was 10 million times deeper than having sex with a dog. Because of the pursuit of eternity, he made a difficult decision, to give up life. He gave up the beauty, nobility, and holiness that the High Elves were most proud of, and willingly became a dirty and ugly Great Lich. What was it for? In the end, wasn't it for eternal power and power? Now, he didn't hesitate to fall, and he even tricked his assistant, his own son, and even his own guards and subjects. You, Duque, a mere human, actually came out and said that I don't need to become a lich to be a scourge for 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years. Although Duque wasn't too handsome, it was still infuriating to compare. An eternally youthful, young man, who looked like he was 18 years old, was 100 million times better than a lich with a rotten face. Ah! What? How could Anastrian stand it? However, just when Anastrian was so angry that his soul was about to melt, the shameless Duque naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity. He decisively made his move. Countless golden, basin-sized, mysterious magic runes appeared on the ground in every corner of the palace. These runes seemed to be just printed at first, but in just 3 seconds, they turned into dazzling runes. Not only did these runes have a huge mysterious power that could be sensed without experience, but they were also connected with each other by shining threads of light, forming a huge magic array that ran through the entire sun-chasing royal court. Ah! The long, dry beard that remained on the Sun King's chin was blown away by the blazing magic wind. Before he could scold, Duque's magic array had already been activated. It was a huge golden pillar of light with a diameter of several kilometers, reaching straight into the sky. The shining pillar that connected this world and released a radiance comparable to the sun could be clearly seen from 100 kilometers away. Duque blew up the palace. Chapter 799. This big move was not the traditional mushroom cloud bomb. The entire palace was like a small model directly burned by a giant welding torch with flames. In an instant, it burned to ashes. Every single elf who witnessed this scene was stunned. In the end, they all understood. Their king had fallen, and the Sunchaser King's court, which was both the palace and the king's exclusive mage tower, was a hurdle that they could not avoid in resisting the invasion of evil. They had no reason to blame Duque. It was just that when Duque used the power of the Sun Well to destroy the palace that had stood in the northwest of Silvery Moon City for thousands of years and had a history as long as Silvery Moon City, they still felt a sense of emptiness and loss in their hearts. This was a collapse of faith. This was the severance of a legacy. Duque's attack, whether intentional or unintentional, directly broke their last hope for the Sunchaser royal family. Yes, the shameless Duque did it on purpose. He did not know if Kale, that's in this life, would fall as he did in the original history. Since Kai, that's chose to kneel to his father, who had become a skeleton, and not be a good loyal minister of the Alliance, he jumped to the side of the rebels and licked the dead Zul, becoming the subordinate of the Burning Legion's subordinate. Kai, that's had to take full responsibility for his actions. Duque did not care who would be the leader of the High Elves, but it definitely could not be the Sunchaser King's family or the Silvery Moon Council. In the face of right and wrong, there was no room for even the slightest bit of sand. Duque's attack was absolutely fierce. He had intended to deal with Anastrian and the entire Sunchaser King's court in one go. Unfortunately, a veteran-breaking Dawn powerhouse was not so easy to kill. Antonidas would not have knelt so easily if he had not been attacked by a large number of dreadlords. If Anastrian had enough will to resist, with the defense of the Sunwell and the Sunchaser King's court, he could have held on for a long time even if he could not win. Of course, if the Sun King did not join the alliance, Duque would rather let the hundreds of thousands of troops sit in the cabin until their butts were sore than let the army come to the rescue. Under such a devastating attack, the Sun King still had the ability to activate a teleportation formation hidden in the palace. The destructive mana of the Well of the Sun had already seriously disrupted the stability of the surrounding space, and even Duque, who had the system elf, did not have the confidence to escape. However, the Sun King had successfully turned into a stream of light and escaped. Duque squinted his eyes, feeling no pity in his heart. He had always been a person who grasped the big and let go of the small. Once the big strategy was achieved, he would not care about the small details. Moreover, the Doomsday Army was not a charity. Arthas wanted the Sun King to block the way, but Anastrian actually dared to run away by himself? In the situation where Zul still had absolute control over the Scourge, please allow Duque to mourn for the Sun King for half a second. At this time, Zul was no different from a young wife who had been brutally abused. Jaden could do whatever he wanted with Zul. He could flatten it or carve Zul's skull into a urinal. Zul could only accept it. Zul was angry at the top, so he could only vent his anger on his underlings. As the underlings of the Burning Legion, when they could complete the boss's task, they could have as many succubi as they wanted, and they could pose in any position they wanted. Not doing their job well? That would be too much. The Scourge was even worse. They did not even have the benefits of succubi, and they were often punished by the soul. This time, it would be strange if Anastrian's soul was not used as fuel, lit on fire, and roasted for chicken wings. So this time, when Duque saw a certain newly promoted Great Lich running away, he only wanted to give this poor thing 4 words, he. The monstrous golden light finally dissipated, and what appeared in front of the tens of thousands of elves was a huge circular ruin that was so clean that it could be used as a skating rink. Some elves cried on the spot. But more elves began to gather and approach Duque. They looked at the great traitor of the High Elves, Kale, that Sunstrider, with eyes that could cut people into 1,000 pieces, while waiting for the final orders of their leaders. Many elves had already secretly tightened their grip on the weapons in their hands. If Servanas, Lor, Themar, and the other leaders gave the order to kill this guy, they would probably pounce on him without hesitation. Kale, that's face was ashen, and his handsome face had lost all its vigor. His emerald green eyes were unfocused, and even though he had already stood up, he looked more like a walking corpse than a zombie at this moment. A few of the prince's loyal followers, such as the great astromancer Solarian, pursed their lips and gripped their staffs tightly as they stood in front of Kale, that's, blocking the increasingly turbulent elven army. Unfortunately, the obstruction of a mere radiant moon mage was meaningless. Just one spark would ignite the anger in everyone's hearts, and the once noble elven prince would be completely destroyed by his own people. Hadgeron was still a little confused. He instinctively hated Kale, who had sold everyone's lives and succumbed to his father's evil might. But he could not personally kill Prince Kale, who had not done anything evil. What do we do? Servanas raised his head and looked at Duque. To a certain extent, this was no longer the internal affairs of a mere elven kingdom. Now, everyone knew that without the support of the alliance, the elves would not be far away from extinction. Duque took a deep breath. Right now, the Alliance's greatest enemy is the Burning Legion and the Scourge Legion, who are trying to destroy the world of Azeroth. The Alliance will definitely strike and absolutely destroy the evildoers and the fallen. When Duque said this, the faces of Kale, and his followers turned pale. Solarian even looked at Duque with a pleading look. Duque understood this look. If he could save Prince Kale, life, this great astromancer was willing to pay any price. At this moment, Servanas and Lor Themar pulled out their arrows at almost the same time. Hadgeron was half a beat slower, and he was also ready to shoot. Kale, that's raised his head and revealed a sad smile. In his once clear and charming eyes, there was no resentment or anger, only a calm acceptance of fate. In the face of people and kinship, in the face of powerful evil and weak justice, he selfishly chose the fallen kinship and the powerful evil. Unfortunately, the seemingly powerful evil was directly defeated by a more powerful strategy and strength. He chose this path himself. Now, it was time for Kale, that's to pay the price. Yes. Even if Duque, who had a good relationship with him, wanted to sentence him to death, he had no regrets. Originally, Kale, that's and his followers were in despair. Who would have thought that the situation would take a turn? The second half of Duque's sentence was, however, Prince Kale, that's actions just now did not directly threaten the alliance. I don't think Kale, that Sunstrider is a despicable fallen. So, in the name of the Supreme Commander of the Alliance, I solemnly declare that the relationship between your kingdom and Kale, that Sunstrider is your kingdom's internal affairs, and the Alliance has no right to interfere. Chapter 800. The three Ranger generals looked at each other and quickly walked together to start an emergency discussion. Not only them, but they also quickly summoned the remaining dozen or so Ranger captains, mage captains, and garrison captains. After a full 5 minutes of discussion, they reached an agreement. As the temporarily elected leader and representative, Sylvanas stood on a stone platform that only had half of it left. When her voice and image were transmitted by magic to every intact magic mirror in Kuel Salis, she spoke loudly. After the discussion of the National Salvation Committee, which was temporarily formed by me, Sylvanas Windrunner, Rothelma Theron, Hageron Mingi, and 18 other high-ranking individuals, I, in the name of the president of the Kuel Salis Salvation Society, declare that Kale, that Sunstrider, who once joined the Scourge army, is a traitor. In view of the fact that Kale, that Sunstrider has not seriously harmed the interests of the High Elves, and based on Kale, that's contribution to the kingdom for more than 1,000 years, we have now decided to strip him of his prince status and sentence him to exile. From now on, Kale, that Sunstrider and his followers must leave the territory of Kuel Salis. At this moment, the camera turned, and Sylvanas asked Kale, that's, Your Highness Kale, that's, do you have any objections to the people's punishment of you? Punishment of exile. This was already a great mercy. Since ancient times, no matter which world or which kingdom, treason was a heinous crime that could easily lead to the death of an entire family. As long as they were ruthless, it would not be a big deal to kill Kale, that's directly. Firstly, Kale, that's was not sentenced to death, and secondly, he was very popular. The democratic tradition of the High Elves was in effect at this time. In addition, even the biggest master, the Alliance, had let Kale, that's go. The High Elves, who were about to follow the Alliance, could not be the clown. In the end, Kale, that's punishment was more like picking it up high and gently putting it down. Understanding this, even though Kale, that's was sad, he had no choice but to accept this fact. The former prince had lost the chance to be crowned king forever because of that kneel. The elves quickly took care of their internal affairs. Without needing Duque to urge them, the anxious elves had already spontaneously organized themselves. Sylvanas raised her arms and shouted, The evil undead are attacking our glory, the sun well. In order to prevent evil from staining our holiness, we must form a stronger assault team to defend the Isle of Quel Danas. Lord Themar ordered in an orderly manner, divide the army according to the area. Arcane puppets will be at the front, infantry in the middle to protect the division, and rangers on the flanks. Reorganize the army immediately. Captains, report your combat power immediately. Hageron, who was in charge of scouting, said, Bring all the ships that can sail here. I need 5 destroyers to scout the eastern side of the island. Immediately send 2 boats to the Alliance to verify the Alliance's flag. We need to coordinate with the Alliance fleet. On the other side, Duque waited for the elemental tremors to subside before opening the portal. The Alliance's rescue team, led by the Bishop of Holy Light Benedictus, quickly rushed to the ruins of Silvermoon City to help the ordinary High Elves save their compatriots. High-grade Paladin Riataline led a team of Silver Hand Paladins to Duque's side. She was about to say something when she saw Kale, that's slowly walking over. Duque stopped Riataline from trying to block in front of him and slowly walked towards Kale, that's. It was difficult to describe the pain in Kale, that's heart. For him, today was destined to be a nightmarish day. His hometown had been invaded, and the capital had fallen. His only relative and king, Anastrian, had fallen. For the sake of his family, and to prevent the tens of thousands of elites from being cruelly slaughtered, the prince had chosen to submit. In the end, the situation had reversed. His father, who had given up almost everything for him, had heartlessly abandoned him, leaving him to fend for himself in front of the angry soldiers. It was a miracle that the pain and despair had not driven him crazy on the spot. "I'm sorry, Duque. I seem to have messed up everything. Although I'm sad about this result, as long as the people can live a safe life, I won't have any complaints. Duque, can you promise me? This is a very easy thing for you." Duque nodded slowly. "Tell me, I'll do it." The higher one's status, the harder it was to talk. Many times, the value of a sentence from Duque could not be described as 1,000 words of gold. Now, Duque had agreed without even asking what the content was. Even though Kale, had never thought that he and Duque were best friends, he still felt that it was worth it to make a friend with Duque. A warm feeling arose in his heart. "You really do understand me. But I still hope that you will say it yourself. You will do your best to help take care of the High Elves." Duque smiled gently. "Of course I will take care of the High Elves." "Nonsense, if I don't take care of them, won't Aurelia and Sasha skin me alive? Then I have no regrets." Unexpectedly, at this moment, Kale, could show such a sincere smile from the bottom of his heart. Duque was stunned for a moment. Then, Duque remembered the tragic ending of Kale, in the original history. In the original history, the Sun King and all the members of the Silvermoon Council had died in this battle. In the history, Arthas was very principled and did not resurrect the Sun King and the others. The only one who was turned into an undead by Arthas was Servanas, who resisted the most fiercely. He turned Ciri into a banshee of death. When Kale, who was still in the Dalajan, rushed back, he encountered a complete mess. The kingdom had been destroyed, and less than 10% of the people were left. Most of the magic people who relied on the magic of the Sunwell for a long time actually had magic addiction, which was commonly known as magic addiction. In order to take revenge, Kaizi brought the healthiest elves back to the Alliance. Unfortunately, they were assigned to the overly suspicious Galadhers, the commander of the Alliance who was fighting against the Scourge army in Lordaeron. In the history of the elves, just like in this life, they left the Alliance after the Second Battle of the Dark Portal. After betraying the Alliance and being crippled, they ran back to lick the Alliance. Naturally, they were looked down upon everywhere. In the end, they were forced to leave the Alliance by Queen Naga Vash's plot and a little deception. In order to solve their magic addiction, they had to rely on Illidan, one of the most unreliable bosses in Azeroth, and used the power of the demon to suppress their magic addiction. Step by step, they were finally tricked by Kill Jaden, and attempted to summon Kill Jaden on the rebuilt Sunwell. This forced the Blood Elves to the opposite side of all the races in Azeroth. In the end, Prince Kale, was betrayed and died tragically on the Isle of Quell, Danas. Thinking of this, Duque could not help but sigh. Chapter 801. In history, the alliance of the Blood Elves and humans had ended up in such a state. Kale, was not the main culprit. The poor prince was born in this era and unfortunately became a victim of history. The choices he made were all choices that ordinary people would make. Therefore, Duque expressed the deepest understanding and sympathy for Kale, who had reached the end of the road. It was just that in the face of ruthless fate, the Blood Elf Prince seemed particularly powerless. Coupled with his lack of courage and his legendary level E luck. Even if he wanted to kill the thief, he was powerless. As for Marshal Garethus, who had tricked Kale into running away, he naturally had to bear the main responsibility for Kale's betrayal. This guy was narrow-minded, blindly subjective, and no matter what, he was not a competent leader. However, in the reality before Duque traveled to, leaders like this who were always suspicious of their subordinates could be seen everywhere. That was why there was such a golden saying, horses of 1,000 li are common, but Bolu is rare. In the hands of Garethus, a talent like Kale would either become a useless horse and die of depression, or he would become a wild horse and be forced to jump ship. Before traveling to another world, players often compared the two princes, Arthas and Kale. Duque was personally very unhappy. In Duque's eyes, Kai Zi was much more adorable than the fool. Although Arthas' original intentions were good, he was too extreme and never listened to anyone's advice. He stubbornly regarded himself as the center of the world, and forcefully hoped that the entire process of the world would develop according to his personal wishes. His fall was due to the conspiracy of the Dreadlord and Kel Thuzad. From another perspective, Arthas' extreme and self-centered personality was also due to the pampering and spoiling of Tarinas, who claimed to be the best in the world. So even though he fell later, what Arthas did was a bloody tragedy like killing his father and teacher. Kale was different. From the beginning to the end, everything this respectable elf prince did was for his people. He hoped that the people would live a good life, that he could take revenge and destroy the Scourge army, that he could solve the people's demon addiction, and that, the first point of departure in everything he does is the people. If Kale, who was so kind and had yet to join the Burning Legion, died tragically, Duque's own conscience would never forgive him. Besides, when Duque was sorting out the information of the Rotterdam East Army a few days ago, Duque accidentally saw Garithos' name. From the dossier that Mograine had given him, Duque saw that Galadhers was as unreliable as he had been in history. Duque directly took out the Queen's seal that Kalia had given him and pushed Garithos to the bottom. He found an excuse to promote him from Brigadier General to Captain and threw him to the front lines as cannon fodder. In less than a week, Duque received a report that this guy had died in battle. Even his corpse had been recovered. Alright, idiots should die early and reincarnate. There was nothing wrong with this sentence. Duque raised his head. Kale, you did wrong this time. We are all high-ranking people, and we all know that there is no room for kinship in the face of great right and wrong. Kale, expression darkened. Duque, you're right to lecture me. Duke sighed in his heart. If Kai Zi had knelt down a little later and waited for him to finish analyzing the Well of the Sun's mana veins with the system elf, Kai Zi's situation wouldn't be as bad as it was now. Do you have any plans? Kale, looked around. Beside him were hardcore supporters such as the great astromancer Solarian and the astromancer Caponia. His face was full of bitterness. We still love our motherland, but unfortunately, more than 3,000 people will be exiled because of my mistake. I've let them down. But to atone, I think we will go to various places in Rotterdam and continue to fight against the Scourge army in our own way, 3,000 people. Originally, Duque wanted to take Kale, people as his private army, but 3,000 people were a little too many. Also, Duque had to consider the feelings of the elves who were more loyal to Kuel Salis, especially Servanas. Servanas, in particular, was a hurdle that Duke could not avoid. Duque took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Do you know what will happen to you? You and those followers who trusted you and entrusted their lives to you will die meaninglessly in the land that the Scourge army has corrupted." Beside the prince, the great astromancer Solarian could not help but roar in grief and indignation. What else can we do? Beside Duque, the paladin Riadaline shouted, "Watch your tone, traitor." Solarian was about to refute when Kale, stopped her. This is my fault. Please don't vent your anger on Duque. The prince's concession made Solarian so sad that she almost cried. Duque gazed at this beautiful elf. He looked at this boss who would have been guarding the storm fortress in the original history of Draenor and would have been killed by the Alliance army. Duque suddenly felt a different kind of emotion. I know that your current status is a little awkward. Actually, if you are still willing to fight for Azeroth, I hope that you will help the Alliance guard the Dark Portal. This way, we can release the original Dalajan mages and put them into the war against the Scourge army. As soon as this sentence was said, there was a hissing sound in the surroundings. This was not Duque treating them badly. On the contrary, he was treating Kale, and the others too well. After so many years of operation, the Watcher Fortress in the Cursed Land was no longer the bitter and cold place it used to be. The guards of the Watcher Fortress were recognized as the most elite troops in the entire Alliance because they often had to fight with the demons and orcs that came out of the spatial rift. In the past 10 years, there was a saying, if you stay in the Watcher Fortress for 3 years, you will be promoted by 3 ranks when you return. Kale, was humiliated because he had succumbed to his fallen father. Now that Duque wanted Kale, to go to the Watcher Fortress, it was to distance Kale, from the rejection of the elves in Kuel Salis. Secondly, they did not have to go to Lordaeron, which had the worst relationship with the elves, to be looked down upon. Thirdly, it was to let them be gilded. Regardless of whether there was a large-scale invasion or not, the Dark Portal was the front line against the demons and orcs. If they could stay at the front line for a few years and return home, everyone would treat them as a warrior of the Alliance. This was the best redemption for Kale, and his followers. Duque, we don't know how to thank you. Of course, we are willing to go to the Watcher Fortress. Duque patted Kai's shoulder. All right then. Get ready. I'll arrange for a ship to send you there. Chapter 802. In fact, after Kai Z renamed the High Elves as Blood Elves, the Blood Elves had another huge problem, mana addiction. As a transmigrator, Duque knew how to deal with mana addiction. Of course, he wouldn't expose the Well of the Sun before it happened. It would be bad enough if the Well of the Alliance accidentally exploded. You could even predict mana addiction. How dare you say you didn't set us High Elves up? Sometimes, it wasn't a good thing to know too much about the situation. It was easy to hide it from outsiders, but not from the Windrunner sisters, who had amazing intuition. Mana addiction was a harmless problem, so Duque simply let it happen. Of course, the premise was that the Well of the Sun had to be contaminated like in history, and then it had to be exploded. As the ultimate treasure of the High Elves, the defense of the Well of the Sun was naturally the most important. The king could be replaced if he died, but if the Well of the Sun exploded, the High Elves' lifeline would be gone. The Well of the Sun was in danger, and the elves all looked like their butts were on fire. Duque. No rush. Speaking of the Well of the Sun, from Duque's point of view, it was better to destroy it. Publicly, as long as the Well of the Sun existed, the High Elves might not be able to use it to create a Breaking Dawn Pharaoh, but they could have as many ordinary mages as they wanted. After 2 disasters, the elves had lost a lot of strength, but given enough time, a new version of the Silver Moon Parliament would be in power sooner or later. Think about it, the High Elves look down on their fellow Night Elves. Would they really look up to humans, dwarves, and gnomes? Once their wings hardened again, the High Elves would definitely start clamoring to separate from the Alliance again. It couldn't be helped. Most of the High Elves had an incurable disease of arrogance flowing in their bones. As long as the Well of the Sun was not damaged, the elves would never be able to completely integrate into the Alliance. Also, privately, the current situation was that the mages had completely declined, and the rangers had risen. The 2 leaders of the rangers, Lor, Themar and Hageron, were the Windrunner sisters' minions. Sylvanas had already become famous in this battle. Duque didn't know how far she could go in the future, but he would be happy no matter which one of the Windrunner sisters came to power. Wasn't it good to have one of their own on the stage? There was no way Duque would deliberately leave the sun well behind to nurture a hostile pharaoh, steal Kuel Salas's power, and set the alliance up, right? In that case, Duque would be a first-class moron. Seeing that Duque and Sylvanas had gathered the High Elves and were preparing to rush to the Well of the Sun, the silly Kale, that's felt warmth in his heart. Indeed, Duque was the eternal best friend of the High Elves. Duque didn't know what Kai Zi was thinking. If he knew, his reputation as the best actor would fall apart today. Upon hearing that Duque wanted to send them away, Kale, that's gritted his teeth and made a slightly unreasonable request. Duque, before I leave, I hope to see that the Sunwell is fine. Movie Emperor Du's expression was solemn. I can't guarantee anything for the Sunwell. I didn't mean to stall for time. Actually, I did it on purpose. Why don't you bite me? You. Astromancer Caponia was indignant. Her intuition told her that Duque wasn't willing to do his best. Kai Zi pulled her back. You'll never know how terrifying Arthas is if you haven't faced him face to face. Your Highness, didn't you and Sir Marcus defeat him once? Caponia asked softly. Kale, that's had personally experienced that battle. Both he and Duque had bitter expressions on their faces. The Calamity Army's foundation was too strong. In that battle, the Alliance had lost a total of 9 peerless experts. The tribe had lost a famous former Great Chief Orgrim, and the Alliance had lost a Breaking Dawn Antonidas. In the end, Arthas had still escaped. It was a huge loss. Duque explained, defeating a peerless expert and destroying one are two completely different things. Moreover, there's information that Arthas became stronger after killing his master, Uther. Otherwise, why do you think His Majesty Anastrian surrendered so easily? The pupils of Kai Zi's followers suddenly shrank. You mean, Antonidas used the power of darkness to suppress the Sun King? The one who really forced the Sun King to surrender was the demigod Arthas. For a moment, the surrounding air fell silent. No one said anything. Finally, Kale, that's mouth twitched a few times. Gritting his teeth, he suddenly knelt down and said loudly, "Is there no way to stop Arthas' madness? Duque, I know you have the best way. If the Alliance can do its best to help Kuel Salas this time, my followers and I are willing to be servants of the Marcus family for the rest of our lives." This time, not only was Duque shocked, even the elves who were running around gathering were so frightened that they stopped in their tracks. It was true that with Kale, that's identity, it was impossible for him to join other forces or serve under someone else in such a despicable way. Although most of the elves united and exiled Kale, that's because of his mistake. Kale, that's was no longer a high and mighty prince on formal occasions. But all the elves still recognized Kale, that's as the prince of the High Elves. Now that Kale, that's suddenly made such a request, all the elves couldn't help but be in awe. No matter how serious Kale, that's mistake of choosing sides was, he was willing to sacrifice himself for the future of the elves. Such an act and such a noble sentiment immediately resonated with the majority of the elves. With the great astromancer Solarian, a famous boss in the future as the leader, all of Kale, that's followers knelt to Duque. This wasn't all of Kai Zi's followers, but there were hundreds of them. It was a spectacular scene to see so many people kneeling in one go. One had to know that Kale, that's oath was very heavy. He didn't know that Duque was actually immortal. He was completely measuring the lifespan of a human by the lifespan of an elf. In his heart, he was prepared to serve Duque and Duque's descendants for the rest of his life, until his own lifespan came to an end. This time, it was Duque who was dumbfounded. Damn, it was naturally very cool to have a prince of a kingdom as a follower. The problem was that Duque hadn't communicated with William yet. Although Duque firmly believed that William would be as wise and powerful as he was in history, it would be difficult to clean up the mess if his Grand Duke took in a High Elven prince as a follower without informing him beforehand. Duke had an idea. Kale, that's... You've caused me so much trouble. I've long prepared a big move against Arthas. Although I wasn't 100% confident, you only came to say that you wanted to be a servant now. If word gets out, it'll be like I've prepared everything before tricking you to be my servant. Chapter 803. Ah. Kale, that's face turned bright red. That's right, Duque always liked to plan before taking action. Previously, they were on different sides, so of course he wouldn't tell the elf if he had a backup plan. Now that he was anxious, yes, he had forced Duque to reveal his backup plan. This was also a big joke. On the other hand, when he forced Duque to reveal his backup plan, it also proved that Duque didn't hide it from him at all. Thinking of this, Kale, that's heart warmed and he relaxed. Duque. A vow is a vow. Just like how I knelt before my degenerate father before, then I had to take responsibility for the choice I made. It's the same now. If the Alliance goes all out to help Kuel Salis this time, we lowly exiles will serve you, Duque, for the rest of our lives. What's wrong with that? As long as you, Duque, don't despise us. Behind Kale, that's, a large group of followers shouted in unison, Lord Marcus, please save Kuel Salis. At that moment, Dooku finally understood why so many people complained about being tired, saying that it was hard to raise a bunch of underlings, but at the same time, they eagerly became the boss. Damn! It feels so good to be the boss of a dignified prince. It feels so good to be the boss of a dignified kingdom's prince. Movie Emperor Du said seriously, just now, I received an official request from Kuel Salis to save the nation. The Alliance is now giving an official response, welcoming Kuel Salis to rejoin the Alliance. The Alliance's army will also enter the Isle of Quel Donas to fight against the Scourge army. As for the big move I'm talking about, early on, after the battle between the Dalajan and Arthas, I sent Sir Mograine to the Iron Furnace Castle. There, His Majesty Magni Bronzebeard is building a light-type divine weapon comparable to Frostmourne for Mograine. That divine weapon should be completed by today. Kale, that's had seen the power of Frostmourne. Although it was not to the extent of being able to freeze 1,000 miles with just a slash of the sword, this runic demon sword with the greatest power to date was definitely a great enemy of every living being. Now that Duque had announced that a divine artifact comparable to Frostmourne was being born, Kale, that's could not help but be filled with hope. When Orgrim was still around, the Hammer of Destruction was only a demigod item, and it could only attack and defend against Arthas. Using a divine artifact to deal with a divine artifact was the true way of kings. As long as they could slightly resist the power of Frostmourne, the entire situation would be completely different. Otherwise, every besieger would be afraid of being pulled over by Arthas at any time and killed like chickens and ducks. Who would dare to use a big move? Kale, that's took out a memory crystal. Duque, this is the secret of the Sunwell that I know. Although it's not much, I think it can help you. Duque took it, and the system elf scanned it for him. He immediately knew what was going on. It should be said that it was different from those black and white bear-shaped national treasures that were only responsible for acting cute. The Sunwell was indeed the national treasure of the High Elves, and its defense system was also the best. In Duque's imagination, the Sunwell should have no resistance since even that bastard Anastrian had surrendered. Unfortunately, perhaps because of the change in Kale, that's fate, the latest data showed that the deviation had reached 28%. Azeroth, which was gradually drifting away from history, seemed to have played a joke on Duque. The highest defense system of the Sunwell was actually not in Anastrian's hands. What? The remnant soul of Dethrima? Dethrima Sunstrider was the founding king of the High Elves' kingdom. Even though he had been exiled by his people, he was still a super impressive person who could expand his territory and create a huge stir. Although the Sunstrider royal family was really getting worse with each generation, no one could deny that Dithrima, as the first Sunstrider, was still very impressive. However, Duque did not expect that Dithrima, who was supposed to have died of old age in history, did not return to heaven and earth, and instead became a special existence like a guardian spirit. Duque was dumbfounded. Duque was not the only one. Arthas, who was heading towards the Sunwell at this moment, was also stunned. If Arthas was still alive in the past, he would have already started cursing. The deeper depravity had obliterated his humanity, and Arthas had now lost more than half of his human emotions. He was more like an emotionless war machine. Unfortunately, there was still an emotion called annoyance accumulating in his spiritual world. Crack! There was a thunderous sound. In the beautiful garden of the High Elves' artistic style, a huge statue that was more than 10 meters tall suddenly came to life. The radiance of arcane energy instantly filled every pattern on the statue's body, and it was very beautiful. What had nothing to do with beauty was the powerful destructive power of this arcane puppet. His heavy punches and kicks, measured in tons, could easily put a horde of undyings to rest. The magic lightning that he threw out at the slightest provocation sent many elite demons flying. Arthas had no choice but to use a small number of bone dragons to attack the Sunwell Highland. Regardless of whether it was an arcane puppet or not, he tried to destroy every statue as much as possible. Even though Arthas advanced step by step, there were still endless traps along the way. For example, he once wanted to freeze the entire Sunwell Highland, but who knew that the opponent would directly connect a certain Sunwell Highland with magic power to Arthas' feet. That terrifying power was even more insane than a volcanic eruption, and it directly wiped out a group of Death Knights that belonged to Arthas. Under the persuasion of the demon sword, Arthas finally gave up on using the magic power collected by Frostmourne to directly fight against the power of the Sunwell. No matter who it is, it's obviously afraid. It doesn't have the strength to fight you at all. Be patient, Death Knight. Frostmourne whispered. In the sky above the Isle of Quell Danas, Antonidas finally found a flaw in Krasis. Icy whirlpool. A gigantic frost tornado large enough to swallow 10 battleships suddenly appeared in the sky. The terrifying suction force comparable to that of a black hole was pulling Krasis' enormous body, trying to drag this magic-proficient giant dragon into the horrifying cold magic vortex and strangle him to death. Krasis flapped his wings frantically but was helplessly pulled back by the suction force. Antonidas let out a proud laugh. Krasis. Give up resisting. For the sake of our years of working together, I'm happy to let you join the Calamity Army. Let me think, a Dracolic. This new identity is very suitable for you. I refuse, Krasis snarled with effort. Don't be in such a hurry to refuse. After you taste the soul torture of Frostmourne, I hope you can still refuse me so stubbornly. Suddenly, Krasis' dragon face revealed a smile. Hey! Is it appropriate to put all your energy on me? Chapter 804. What exactly was integrity? This was an extremely mysterious question. A person without integrity was definitely a hooligan. A person full of integrity was probably a saint. But if a person with integrity was always randomly fluctuating, only God knew if he was a human or not. In Antonidas' eyes, Duque was a collection of super contradictions. He had seen Duque, who was full of holiness and was even more saintly than a saint. He had also seen Duque, who hid the fact that Deathwing was the Lord of Presto, and even tricked his own leader, Tyrinas, and the traitorous version of Duque who had kidnapped the princess. After all, he had known Duque for more than 10 years, and he had known Krasis for more than 30 years. Now that Krasis had suddenly changed his style, and this experienced magic dragon changed his previous strategy, his rich combat experience saved the life of this old mage and new Grand Lich. Attack! Just as expected. Keenly aware of the inconspicuous but real magic fluctuations behind him, Antonidas immediately used Blink to leave where he was. Sure enough, less than a tenth of a second after he left, a shining golden hand made of magic suddenly appeared where he was just a moment ago. 5 fingers that were condensed with powerful magic quickly closed, but unfortunately, they grabbed nothing. The great power that was enough to instantly crush an ogre into meat paste was useless. This is... Antonidas's ashen face twitched. What a waste. There was no sense of beauty at all. A huge amount of magic was injected into a large model of a hand without any skill. If it wasn't Duque who cast the spell, Antonidas would definitely feel the deepest disdain and contempt for this spell that seemed to be only at the level of a magic apprentice. Why did one need to chant to cast a spell? Why did the more powerful the spell, the longer the chanting time? For thousands of years, countless magic apprentices had asked their mentors this question. Third-rate mentors would tell their students that this was how the magic was developed by the predecessors of the path of magic, and that it was not allowed to change. Then, when the students asked questions such as why they could use metamagic abilities to shorten the casting time, they would become speechless. On the other hand, the first-rate academy mages would carefully analyze the components of this spell with their disciples. Opening a tunnel in the elements realm with magic and attracting the elemental power was indeed the core of the spell. But that was not the most important part. The most important part was the additional incantations that shaped the elements, stabilized their characteristics, and indicated their targets. These incantations actually limited the range and function of the magic, making the magic more controllable and safer. However, what Duque was doing now had almost overturned most of the magic knowledge and theories. First, it was a flaming hand, then 10, then 100. In the beginning, it was still barely taking shape, but in the end, it was simply throwing fire elements at Antonidas. It was as if I was the one who had opened the dam. I didn't care how the downstream would be flooded. In the sky, a large stretch of beach near the southeast had turned into a sea of fire. The seawater evaporated, and the high temperature of the steam, which was hot enough to burn and choke mortals to death, filled the entire sky. However, it condensed in an entire area and did not dissipate. With Antonidas as the center, the beach with a radius of more than 5 kilometers was surrounded by a small volcano. The small volcanoes spewed golden flames into the sky. Antonidas was about to go mad from the indignation. As a veteran breaking dawn, even though many of his magic circuits had been stripped away by Duque, he still used his rich knowledge and the mana stored in the Dalajan Mage Tower to quickly replenish his lost magic circuits. He could announce without exaggeration that he would not be afraid of any breaking dawn mage he met. But now, he felt a tremble from the depths of his soul. For a moment, he almost thought that he was fighting against an Astrian at his peak, and not a mere radiant moon Duque. Impossible! He subconsciously shouted, but immediately slapped his own mouth. But if it's Duque, the various miracles of Duque in the past surfaced in his mind. He still remembered that in the broken ridge of the Alterac Mountains, Duque had borrowed his magic power to create an ice tornado that cut down hundreds and thousands of young red dragons. He could still remember that when he faced the dark portal that even he was afraid of, it was also Duque who used his extraordinary control over his power to close the portal that connected the two worlds. He still remembered that when the Dalajan had fallen, the Mage Towers had suddenly gone out of control, causing the Calamity Army's encirclement to turn into a battle of attrition. Now that he thought about it, Duque was not that good in a one-on-one fight, but once he was given power, his battle strength would skyrocket. He could practically fly. At this moment, Antonidas wished that there was medicine for regret in this world. He would definitely buy one even if he had to spend all his fortune. It was a good thing that he and Arthes had forced an Astrian to surrender. Arthes advancing at the front and destroying the defenses of the Sunwell Plateau was also a good thing for the Calamity Army. Who would have thought that making the Sunwell lose its core master would instead give Duque an opportunity to take advantage of? Without a controller, Duque could easily control the mana veins flowing out of the Sunwell. Because of the natural restraints, the two great liches were no match for Duque, who had mastered the mana of the Sunwell tributary, even though they had Breaking Dawn mana. They would be so stupid as to give their knives to Duque and then offer their necks to him. For a second, Antonidas almost wanted Arthas to stop advancing and return to deal with Duque first. Unfortunately, it was impossible to think about it. Invading the Sunwell was the highest level mission that the Lich King had ordered. Arthas would not care no matter how many sacrifices he had to make. He had sensed the Sun King escape just now, and in less than 3 seconds, the Lich King's soul punishment had arrived. Now, the soul circuits of the entire Calamity Army's higher-ups were filled with Anastrian screams. Duque! I'll fight you to the death! Antonidas roared. He gathered every drop of dark power he could and flashed in the direction that he had sensed. Fight? How are you going to fight me? On the beach, at the crater of a huge volcano that was at least 10 stories high, the mana of the Sunwell, which could not be measured, was spewing out crazily. Miraculously, almost every trace of the mana bypassed Duque, who was in the middle of the crater. It brushed past Duque and sprayed into the air before transforming into various forms and smashing at Antonidas. Chapter 805. If Antonidas' ice attack was a steady song of death, then Duque flame combo was the wildest jazz. At this moment, it wasn't just Duque who was fighting. The entire Isle of Quell Danas was burning with the flames of war. On the west coast of the island, the Alliance launched an offensive that exceeded the imagination of the Calamity Army. Led by the peak Radiant Moon mage Gina Jinjian, the mages from various countries joined forces to cast spells and followed Duque's instructions to create a path of ice. After the spacious and slow troop ships approached the coast, they spent a large number of magic crystals to seal the sea between the troop ships and the coast. Praise life! For this world not to be occupied by death. Burn those damned bones 1,000 times over. The Scarlet Cross under the leadership of General Abendis became the first Marine Corps in the history of the world of Azeroth. The blood-red tide drowned the snow-white surface of the ice and directly rushed into the undead camp that had been plowed into pieces by the cannons. Battle cries shook the heavens and earth. Dense black cannonballs covered the sky like raindrops, and on the golden beach, countless soldiers in red armor trampled on the rotten bones that had been smashed and swarmed forward. It was unclear whether it was the angry shouts of humans or the low cries of the undead. Lich Rasfrost Whisper, who had just been resurrected by Arthas and was entrusted with a heavy responsibility, tried his best to control the situation, but he was shocked by an unexpected situation. It was a paladin whose body was as red as the rising sun. He waved a super great sword that looked like a giant blade, and every swing of it blocked the terrifying radiance that was as bright as the sun, turning large swathes of the undead into ashes. The elite undead legion that Ras had commanded to go up when the cannons stopped were directly cut in half like butter being cut by a sharp knife. The 2-meter-tall holy light giant horse emitted a golden radiance as it charged towards him as if it was galloping in a racetrack. Repentance. With the support of the terrifying great sword, the paladin's control skill, which had a very close range, crossed the void of 100 meters and landed on Ras's head. Suddenly, the power of holy light poured into Risa's evil soul, causing him to feel dizzy and unable to move at all. When he came back to his senses, he saw a holy knight wrapped in golden flames sitting on a warhorse that looked like the rising sun. The holy knight had already arrived in front of him and was looking down at him from above. Those eyes that seemed to be burning with flames made his heart palpitate. Perish! You filthy soul! Accompanied by an intimidating roar, the great sword cleaved through Lich Liss' vision. The burning pain that followed caused Rhys' soul to let out his last miserable howl in this world. In theory, as long as the phylactery was not destroyed, a lich could resurrect again and again through the phylactery. The premise of this theory was that the lich's soul had not been damaged. However, this shockingly powerful light elemental sword had completely overturned the laws of physics that swords and sabers were unable to harm souls. The powerful holy light attached to it completely burned Ras Frostwhisper's soul, erasing this evil soul from this world. Almost at the same time, the undead army on the beach fell into chaos. They still tried their best to attack every living being, but they lacked coordination. In front of the well-organized and experienced human elites, they were no different from training targets. Long live! Well done! All hail Lord Mograine! All the Scarlet Cross warriors from Lordaeron and the knights from the Silver Hand cheered in unison. That's right. The one who easily killed Ras Frostwhisper was the deputy commander of the Alliance, Alexandros Mograine, who had just returned from Iron Furnace Castle. The holy greatsword in his hand, which looked a little like a broadsword with a square head, was the original sword that had changed hands several times in history. It was the sword that had wandered between light and darkness, and was finally wielded by the legendary paladin Tyrion Fordring, who had destroyed Arthes's Frostmourne. It was the Ashbringer. The undead army fell apart on the beach, and the black war flags fell one after another. Seeing this scene, Mograine knew that he had won the first battle. Alessandro. General Abendis excitedly urged his horse forward. Alfred. I'm starting to understand why Commander Marcus wanted me to go to Iron Furnace Castle. In the past, when they talked about Duque, Mograine and Abendis would call him by his name because they were familiar with each other. Today, they used honorifics. You're so lucky. The stone in your hand is actually a top-grade light stone. Now, we should be able to fight Arthes fair and square. Abendis waved the new greatsword in his hand. Although it was not a demigod weapon, it was still a top-grade epic weapon. Similarly, it was a holy weapon that Magni Bronzebeard had forged. Really? Lucky? No. Alfred. I don't think so. Do you still remember Mediv? When he turned into a crow and came to warn us, we scolded him for being a dirty liar and an unqualified charlatan. Who knew? It seems that Karazhan's wizards have a magical ability to foresee. In the face of Mograine's exclamation, Abendis was speechless for a moment. Mograine waved his hand. After all, this is just speculation. I have no evidence. There is also no need to prove it. After all, the legendary prophets who are proficient in prophecy will pay a high price when peering into the future. We just need to know that Sir Marcus can lead us to victory. That's right. On the southeast coast of the island, gorgeous elven warships, regardless of model, all rushed to the beach. Feeling the impact coming from under her feet, a strong and beautiful figure followed the powerful momentum and directly swooped down like a giant eagle, descending on the beach. Just as she descended, more than 36 arrows containing the power of wind and lightning burst out, and a total of 18 of the most threatening giant crypt fiends fell in response. Servanas suddenly raised his longbow, and a clear and melodious shout spread in all directions. For Quell Dorii. The follow-up troops that landed burst into thunderous shouts in unison, for the glory of the sun. An assault group of nearly 30,000 elves. Although the number was small, their strength was definitely not to be underestimated. It was no exaggeration to say that this was already the last elite of the High Elves, and also the strongest elite. Mixed with a large number of huge arcane puppets, the momentum of this elven army was no weaker than the human coalition on the other side of the island. Chapter 806. Ras Frostwhisper, that idiot, failed again? There was not a trace of blood on his elegant face. He was draped in a black knight's cloak and wielded a crimson greatsword. His blue-black armor was suffused with a black deathly aura, and he was riding a skeletal warhorse with 2 white goat horns. A terrifying figure appeared on top of a small hill in the southeast of the beach. Following that, more figures with similar appearances appeared. They were the core forces under Arthas, the Death Knights led by Baron Rivendare. A vanguard with arcane puppets as the arrowheads. Rivendare sneered as he put on his gauntlets. This is the trump card of those long-eared creatures. Let's go, I want a calamitous victory, for His Majesty the Lich King. Behind him, the Death Knights in black armor unsheathed their gleaming swords. Their deep-set eyes glowed red as they replied in unison, by the will of Zul. They charged. The seemingly weak skeletal warhorses possessed unimaginable agility and strength. They carried heavy armor and carried a fully armored knight, yet their movements were comparable to those of apes. Normally, heavy knights wouldn't like a sandy battlefield, but in front of the skeletal warhorses, it was no different from flat ground. The giant arcane puppets that shook the earth with every step turned into clumsy puppets in front of the Death Knights. The Death Knights used their dark magic and superior weapons to quickly dismantle the war machines that the High Elves were so proud of. In the name of the Holy Light, it was clear that ordinary elven warriors and rangers were defenseless in front of the Death Knights. A high-ranked paladin, Rhiadaline, led the Silver Hand Paladins to the front lines. This made Rivendare frown, but he soon revealed a smile. Paladins. It's the fall of paladins that makes it interesting. The more devout a paladin was, the more powerful they would become when they fell. With Arthas as an example, the Lich King had spread this hint within the Scourge. If they could drag the strongest paladin down, the Scourge would also have the strongest Death Knights. More than one Undying looked at the 7 Silver Sages. It was a pity that the 7 Silver Saints weren't just any Tom, Dick, and Harry. Other than Uther's soul, who had died in battle, and Tyrion and Gavin Rad who were still trapped in Karazhan, Bolvar, Reginald, Sidan, and Turalyon were mostly commanders who led large armies whenever they went out. Below them were the likes of Mograine and Abendis, who were equally difficult to deal with. Now that Rivendell had discovered a high elven paladin whose aptitude was not below that of the 7 Silver Sages, he was excited to hunt him down. Noiselessly, Rivendell's skeletal warhorse that was coveted by countless players in Duzé's world began to accelerate. That was an extremely fast speed. What was even more unfathomable was that Rivendell was able to become one with his mount after accelerating to the limit. Using the shadows of his Death Knights as cover, he was able to shuttle through the shadows. Hammer of Wrath. Channeling the holy light in her body, Rhiadaline smashed a Death Knight and his horse into smithereens with a single swing of her hammer. But just as she was about to unleash a new attack, Rivendell's crimson two-handed sword arrived. It was an angle that she would never have noticed. Just a tenth of a second ago, her comrade, a male paladin with long golden hair, was standing there. But the blade of the sword avoided the paladin's neck and pierced through the back of his hair, aiming for Rhiadaline's carotid artery. Divine Shield. Rhiadaline, who had no time to dodge or block, immediately tried to activate the paladin's life-saving skill. But she was a step too late. Her vision was filled with illusions of terrifying existences baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. It was obvious that she was ambushed by a powerful warlock. With the power of the holy light and her extraordinary willpower, the power of fear was not too strong. It only affected her movements slightly. In a battle between experts, there was only a fine line of difference. This fine line could mean the difference between life and death. Just as she was about to be struck by the sword, Rhiadaline saw the existence that ambushed her. It was the psychic Dean Gatling, another powerful enemy ranked by the Alliance. He was no longer a human, but a lich. Everything seemed to have nothing to do with Rhiadaline because she was about to die, and if a miracle didn't happen, it was a bolt of lightning that fell from the 9 heavens. In the nick of time, the first thing that arrived was the dazzling purple lightning. After a full second of delay, the ear-shattering explosion rang out. Bang! Rumble, double shot. But they hit the targets at different distances at the same time. Dean Gatling used flash to dodge half of the attack, but in the midst of the flickering light, he was still hit. Half of his robe was blown to pieces, revealing a skeletal body that only had bones left. Rivendell didn't have it any better either. One of the undead warhorse's horns was blown off. The undead warhorse couldn't withstand the destructive power and was sent flying, throwing Rivendell out. Sylvanas? The female paladin cried out in surprise. The agile Death Knight didn't seem to give up and used a dark spell on Riadaline. But the female paladin recovered and used Holy Light to negate the spell. "Kill that female ranger first," Gatling shouted. Rivendell changed his target and charged at Sylvanas. Their choices were usually correct. Compared to the paladins, who had thick skin, could heal themselves, and were invincible, rangers were too weak. If it was an ordinary ranger, the combination of the Death Knight and Pharaoh would definitely be a nightmare. Rivendell ran over and stretched out his left hand, attempting to use the power of darkness to pull Sylvanas over. Unfortunately, he failed. According to Sylvanas' movements, his arm turned 12 times. In fact, the high-speed Sylvanas changed directions a total of 36 times. Her speed was so fast that only a series of illusory afterimages were left behind. And every time she changed directions, 3 lightning bolts would be shot out. 2 were for Gatling and Rivendell, and 1 was for the Death Knight who wanted to get involved in this pinnacle confrontation. These elite Death Knights were powerful enough to take on 100 enemies at once. Unfortunately, the one in front of them was the stronger Sylvanas. Gatling couldn't hold on any longer after the 12th arrow. From the 20th arrow onwards, his body began to explode from the lightning. The remaining 16 arrows were more like a whipping of a corpse. Rivendell wasn't much better off. He could split apart the arrows, but he couldn't block the powerful lightning bolts. By the time he recovered from the paralysis effect of the lightning, he discovered that a bowstring as bright as the moon was already stuck to his neck. In the next instant, a rather handsome head was sent flying into the sky. Chapter 807. Seeing that their boss was so powerful, the elven army, which had been in a mess due to the Death Knight's counterattack and was about to collapse, suddenly burst into cheers. "Oh, oh, oh, Bones' leader is dead." Hadgeron did not expect to hear Lord Themar shout, "Long live Sylvanas," and "Long live the goddess of war." His shouts were immediately echoed by the elves. "Long live Sylvanas." Such voices echoed throughout the entire beach. Standing on the high hill, Sylvanas stood against the wind. The thick clouds seemed to have thinned due to the fall of the 2 commanders of the Scourge army. A ray of golden sunlight shone through the gaps in the clouds and shone on Sylvanas, making her look great. It was as if a god had descended, an irresistible visual impact for mortals. Ah! The goddess of war! The goddess of war! The goddess of war! The elves' fighting spirit was obviously burning. Hadgeron quickly flashed to Lord Themar's side and grabbed his friend's shoulder. "Lord Themar, you," unexpectedly, Lord Themar pulled him over and whispered into his ear, "Isn't this good? The kingdom is falling. Our king and prince have betrayed their subjects and want to push all elves into the abyss of death. We may be able to hold on for a while, but what next? The high elves need a hero. A flag. A leader." Hadgeron's eyes narrowed. He completely understood what his friend meant, and his breathing quickened. Actually, if it's Aurelia, his meaning was clear. If the kingdom had to have a new queen, then the steady and magnanimous Aurelia was undoubtedly more suitable. They're both Windrunner sisters. I don't think there's much difference for Duke Marcus. Plus, the one standing here at the moment of the kingdom's fall is Sylvanas. To be a hero, one needed strength, timing, and luck. Perhaps Aurelia was more suitable, but she was currently trapped in the void of Karazhan, and she did not have the royal bloodline, so the people would only recognize Sylvanas, who had stood up for them when they were at their most desperate. It wasn't Aurelia, who had a better personality and was more suitable, nor was it Kale, who had once bent his knees. Moreover, with the relationship between Duque and the Windrunner sisters, no matter which of them ascended to the throne, they would definitely receive the full support of the alliance. This was of utmost importance to the extremely weak Kuel Salas. After thinking quickly, Hageron finally nodded. At this moment, Sylvanas, who was wholeheartedly focused on the battle, did not know that the two subordinates she relied on the most were ready to help her ascend the throne. She was fighting with all her heart. When the armies of the Alliance and the Elves successfully occupied the beach and sent reinforcements to shore, the commanders of both sides saw a red and gold flood converging together as the battle line advanced. 13 years. There had been arguments. There was filth. There had been enmity. They had thought that differences in ideals and escalating skirmishes at the border would eventually lead to war. After all, there were countless examples of such things in history. Who would have thought that today, the kings of both Lordaeron and Kuel Salas were dead? Grand Duke Mograine held Ashbringer in his hand as he stood amidst the crimson torrent of Rotterdam's heavy cavalry, staring at the golden formation not far away. The one in the lead was a valiant goddess of war with a bow slung over her back and riding a white chocobo. Mograine muttered to himself, "What the hell, don't tell me that both countries will have a queen." The humans already knew about Quell, the loss, but sometimes the so-called official business was just like that. Under the command, the knight who passed the order raised a flag of inquiry, a blue flag of the Alliance, and pointed to the north. "Are we still allies?" The elves did not hesitate, immediately raising a holy flag with golden edges and a white background. On the flag, there was a pair of tightly clenched hands, one of the elves and the other of the humans. That was the flag that the former Sun King Anastrian and Thoradin the Great had decided to use when they formed an alliance 2,800 years ago. This flag only meant one thing: the Holy Oath was still in effect. The two armies were getting closer and closer. Mograine and Sylvanas saw each other. They were not familiar with each other. They had met a few times, but they had never talked in detail. However, they had experienced the second battle at the Dark Portal together and had no grudges against each other, so they were familiar with each other. "When do we attack north?" Sylvanas asked anxiously. The elves were going all out, but their power was still limited. The alliance was still the key. Mograine glanced at the dwarven steam tanks that were driving onto the beach, then retracted his gaze and looked at the dazzling magic battle in the distance. "It'll be hard for us to push forward until the battle above is decided." The Scourge was easy to deal with, but their gazes fell on the battle between the two top wizards in the world. Battle power that surpassed mortals could not be ignored. It was just like 13 years ago at the Arthi Highlands. Nearly 300,000 troops had been unable to advance because of the fierce attack of the Red Dragon Legion. If they could not defeat the enemy's Breaking Dawn, then even if the allied army of the Alliance and the Elves succeeded in stopping Arthas, they would have to pay a heavy price. This was an extraordinary confrontation between a newly advanced Breaking Dawn Grand Wizard, Duke Marcus, and a veteran Breaking Dawn expert, Antonidas. It was not that Antonidas did not try to call for help in this battle, but whether it was the two former Kirin Tor counselors who had fallen to become liches or the Radiant Moon Warlock from the Cursing Sect, they were all stopped by the Alliance. Krasus, who had returned to his human form, Dellen's old lover Gina Jinjian, and Duque's fiancée Jaina Proudmoore all joined the battle, entangling the evil mystics. This made Antonidas feel bitter. Mortals always thought that Breaking Dawn was the strongest in the world. Every magic mystics envied Breaking Dawn wizards who had an endless supply of mana like the sun. Only those who had reached the Breaking Dawn realm would understand that even Breaking Dawn wizards were divided into ranks. The Breaking Dawn symbolized the Son of Dawn, and the sun was the standard star in astronomy. According to the ranking of magic from ancient times, with reference to the brightness of the star, a Breaking Dawn wizard was only a rank 6 Breaking Dawn. The strongest rank 1 Breaking Dawn was 100 times stronger than a rank 6 Breaking Dawn. Antonidas, who had just returned to rank 5 after his magic circuit had been stolen, felt like he had run into the real sun. Chapter 808. The cold wind blew the black snowflakes, and the dense power of darkness descended from the sky, colliding with the golden sand on the ground that contained fiery magic power in the air. In the sky, the scattered black clouds were quickly gathering again. The canopy of the undead existed to isolate the light of the sun and prevent the weather from affecting the Scourge army. After all, a hot sun would accelerate the decay of corpses and reduce the combat power of undead creatures such as ghouls. Now, for only one reason, the Lich King had gathered his power. Your Majesty Zul, now your great enemy, Duke Marcus, controls part of the power of the Sunwell. I, who am weak, am no match for him. Please bestow upon me the power to destroy your enemy. In Zul's heart, Arthas, who had the most perfect aptitude and whose soul had fallen into the darkest hell, was his ideal spokesperson and the carrier of his future body. In the entire Scourge army, Zul had been trying to cultivate Arthas' authority. Logically speaking, this kind of behavior of directly asking for power without Arthas was not allowed. When he heard the name Duque deeply pierced his heart, evoking the memory that he did not want to recall in the depths of his soul. If not for Duque's obstruction, he might have succeeded when he opened the dark portal for the second time. He would have been able to escape to a place where Jaden's perception could not reach. Perhaps it was a corner of the universe, or a planet in a bad situation. No matter which one it was much better than now. After all, Jaden was not an omniscient and omnipotent god. If he had been a step earlier, maybe, he would not have ended up in such an embarrassing state. After suffering all kinds of torture, even his soul was bitterly sealed in an ice skeleton, becoming a puppet of the Burning Legion. Zul hated it. He changed his mind. In front of the coalition army of the High Elves, the undead creatures fell in large numbers. They were like dried corpses that had their blood sucked dry by vampires, and then after 1,000 years of sun, rain, and wind erosion, they actually carbonized and dissipated in the wind. Mograine, Servanas, and the others were tongue-tied. They suddenly had a very bad premonition. Undead creatures wouldn't court death. Their own death could only mean one thing: their master wanted them to be destroyed. Even for the Calamity Troop, which had no regard for capital, this was not a price that could be easily paid. And so Zul did. What he got in return was the terrifying figure in midair whose aura had skyrocketed. A quarter of an hour ago, Antonida's attacks were unable to advance. In the next second, the magic power around Antonida's skyrocketed. It was the dark energy squeezed out from hundreds of thousands of undead creatures and spirits. This terrifying power was so dense that it dyed the sky with a diameter of more than 10 kilometers black with the Great Lich as the center. At first glance, it looked like an incomparably huge lump of black mud that was still constantly churning. Humans, elves, dwarves. Everyone who witnessed this scene revealed expressions of fear. The air became heavy, and all that was left was the sound of the mortals trying their best to suppress their gasps. Was this still an enemy that mortals could fight against? Suddenly, Servanas raised the reins, and the chocobo beneath her let out a loud screech. "What are you doing?" Mograine asked immediately. "Attack." Servanas answered proudly. "Wait. Duque called us." "Yes. He's the commander. But he's facing Antonidas, not Arthas. The Sunwell is under threat. And we. Because we refuse to wait for death. That's why we're here." Mograine and Abendis were speechless for a moment, but then they understood. Duque's old habit was acting up again. As a commander, he was almost perfect and picky. But in the alliance, there was a saying, Duque always liked to pay the smallest price, and then fight for the biggest victory under this premise. A leader who cherished his subordinates could easily gain the love and respect of his subordinates. Most of the time, one could not win just by cherishing their subordinates. This was a terrifying opponent that had destroyed 2 of the alliance's kingdoms and swept through most of the continent. It was an opponent that could never be defeated by sheer attrition. Mograine and Abendis looked at each other and smiled. Then Mograine raised the huge Ashbringer in his hand high. Brothers! Why are we here? Isn't it all for the sake of killing our beloved King Terenas, the fallen demon Arthas? Those who don't have the courage to face death, get back on the ships now. The rest of you, follow me. Servanas gave Mograine an admiring look. She also raised the bow in her hand. For our son, for Quell Dor Dash, with the determination to fight, the 200,000-strong army rolled north, chasing after Arthas with no intention of turning back. Feeling the movement of the army around him, Duque laughed. Those guys. But that's good. Only like this is the Queen Sylvanas I love. Facing the world of Azeroth that was becoming more and more biased, Duque always felt a little troubled. No intervention. If those tragic scenes were to repeat themselves, he wouldn't be able to bear it. Intervention. It would often lead to all kinds of unpredictable events. He was always worried that those great heroes who were originally famous in history would grow old and become useless. He was also afraid that because of the changes he experienced, he would no longer be he, and she would no longer be she. He was afraid that the best wishes in his heart would be different from reality, and he would not be able to adapt. Now, with the help of the system's telescopic function, Duque saw Mograine riding forward on a warhorse in order to kill evil. He saw Servanas with her blonde hair flying in the wind. Duque suddenly felt a real sense of spirit. What was a hero? Heroes were abstract and vague. There was never an accurate definition of a hero. But every time there was a disaster, when a seemingly weak figure stood up for his compatriots and did not hesitate to charge at a seemingly invincible enemy, their figure would overlap with the legendary hero. Ah! This was indeed an era of heroes. Looking at Antonidas, who was attacking wildly with his surging power, and feeling the vast and boundless dark magic that far surpassed even the branch of the Sunwell, Duque's lips curled into a smile. This smile suddenly gave Antonidas a bad feeling. Could it be? Duque still had a trump card? Yo! Antonidas, do you think I haven't learned any new tricks after staying in the void for 10 years? Chapter 809. How many decades do you have in your life? Even though Duque was theoretically immortal and had an endless lifespan, he did not have a decade to squander in a world as dangerous as Azeroth. When Duque encountered a bottleneck in his training in Karazhan and could not advance, Duque could live a depraved life of threesome every day. Even Alexstrasza once said to Duque, "You're too impatient. Not only do you lack the accumulation of mana, but you also lack the proficiency and experience to use mana. I know you're a genius, but no matter how much of a genius you are, you can't do what mortals need 100 years to do in 10 years. Duque shook his head, but he did not give up and continued to work hard. Didn't you see the situation in the later stages of history where demigods were as common as dogs and ancient gods were everywhere? Didn't you see even the creation titans annealing one after another? Didn't you see almost all the dragon aspects perish? But Duque did not. It was this foresight that filled him with a thirst for power all year round. Unable to accumulate more mana and change the mana in his body from quantitative to qualitative, Duque quietly thought about his own path. Am I really a gifted genius mage who specializes in some kind of magic and has a body of frost and body of fire? Am I a true master of magic, a master of learning who can understand any magic, no matter how long, obscure, or incredible it is? Am I the lucky star who has great luck, wins big prizes every day, has fortuitous encounters every week, and opens treasure troves every year? Am I the lucky star who can do everything? Every time he asked himself, the answer was no. Then how did I get to such a high position? There were only two answers. One was the deep memory of the original history as a transmigrator. The other was the omnipotent system elf in terms of data. As a powerful mage who had fought at least 1,000 duels in front of the steel stove castle in the game, Duke could be said to have beaten up warriors, thieves, and hunters. In fact, he had fought almost all of the 9 main classes. Except for a certain despicable priest who was willing to plant a flag on the edge of the Furnace Castle's cliff and try to use mind control to throw Duke down the cliff when the duel started. Apart from those shameless warlocks who were only willing to bring hellhounds with high magic resistance to duels with wizards, Duke had never been afraid of anyone. At the end of the day, there was only one conclusion: the essence of a mage was never in their ability to deal damage, but in their control. When it came to controlling the enemy, combined with his greatest advantage, the system elves, what could be born? The answer was obvious. If it was said that whoever had more strength would be the winner in a battle, then there was no need to fight at all. Everyone who fought in melee would compete with their muscles, and those who used magic would compete with their magic power. The winner could immediately show off, and the loser would be kicked out on the spot. Duque narrowed his eyes and stared coldly at the sky. Supported by an icy mist, Antonidas stood proudly in the air. When he heard that Duque had practiced a new move, he also laughed. New move? Very good. I want to see what kind of new move you, a genius wizard who has never had a master and reached the peak of the Radiant Moon realm on your own, can come up with. You won't be disappointed. Duque smiled calmly. Humph. At this moment, the dark clouds in the sky suddenly moved, and an icy pillar of light descended like lightning. It landed on the Great Lich's body, as if it had draped an incomparably large ice robe with sparkling snowflakes coiled around it. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The Great Lich's robe's sleeves fluttered in the wind. This breaking dawn spell that was about to be cast seemed to contain the might of heaven and earth. Even the Radiant Moon wizards fighting thousands of meters away could clearly feel that the fire element in the atmosphere was being rapidly drawn away. No, perhaps it was being repelled. In short, there was not a single drop of fire element left in the area where Duque and Antonidas were fighting. The power that Duque had drawn from the branch vein of the sun well dissipated in less than 1/100th of a second after reaching the surface. I'd like to see how a mere Radiant Moon wizard like you can withstand my most powerful spell without any external support. Antonidas' roar reverberated in the surroundings, and he pointed at Duque with a withered finger. Go. Go? What do you mean go? Everyone's doubts were immediately answered. Suddenly, a wolf's howl came from the sky. In less than 3 seconds, the echoing howls filled the sky, and the distant howls seemed to be approaching them at an astonishing speed. In just a moment, the howls seemed to be right next to their ears. The sky started to tremble. It was clearly impossible for any creature to run or walk in the sky, but everyone could hear the sound of galloping horses. Mograine, who was leading his army forward, pulled on the reins of his warhorse and stopped it. The middle-aged paladin who wasn't wearing a helmet couldn't help but change his expression. It wasn't just him and the knights around him who stopped at the same time. Even the High Elves' army stopped in their tracks, and more than 200,000 people looked in the direction of the howls. A pack of snow-white wolves. To the people who lived in the land of ice, snow wolves were not rare. However, ordinary wolves could not fly. Even those who clearly knew what kind of creature the howls came from could not be sure. It was a pack of wolves soaring in the sky, weaving back and forth and drawing dazzling white lines in the air. Just based on their form, they were Northren's wargs. However, their bodies were larger than horses, and the cold mana that lingered around them made it hard for anyone to be certain. If anything went wrong, the legends of these terrifying creatures would spread throughout the entire Eastern Kingdom from today onwards. Northrend's wargs weren't scary. A simple, blizzard, spell wasn't scary either. However, when Antonidas used blizzard to smash out countless icicles, and every icicle had the soul of a warg, they knew how to attack in groups, find flaws, and attack in groups. Coupled with the terrifying dark mana that the Lich King had bestowed upon them, the power of this combination was more than 100 times greater than that of a mere wolf pack. Duque. If you don't want to die in the wolves' mouths and be torn to pieces before being painfully resurrected as a lich, you should obediently submit to His Majesty the Lich King. Antonidas shouted. Pfft! Duque burst out laughing. I'm not going to submit to someone who was defeated by me. Humph. Don't blame me then. More than 100 Northrend wargs brazenly pounced on Duque. As they pounced, Duque lightly grabbed with his hand, and the world around him trembled slightly. Duque's mana wasn't strong, but it was as if he had grabbed the strings of a puppet, and the dozens of giant wolves dissipated in the air. Chapter 8:10. The giant frost wolves flying in the sky seemed to have their own souls and clear will, but in reality, all control was still in Antonidas's hands. A thread invisible to the naked eye and not belonging to elemental sensing extended from Antonidas's soul to the giant wolf's body. That was the thread of the soul realm. Now, Duque had broken all the soul threads with a single hand. It wasn't that Duque had destroyed the giant frost wolves, but that the self-destruction spell formation on the giant wolves had been forced to activate. Once they lost control, they would self-destruct. This was a common tactic used by most summoners. Who would have thought that Duque would use this to his advantage? But how did Duque do this? Antonidas was momentarily stunned. His turbid eyeballs kept turning as he adjusted his spiritual vision, trying to see the truth from the elemental undulations and other characteristics that Duque was releasing. No. In reality, Antonidas had already sensed that it was that move. He just couldn't be sure. That move was too cruel for a mage, and the price was too high. Apart from those who had no hope of improving themselves, no mage would choose that path. They had once been comrades on the same side, but now they had to face each other. Antonidas didn't have the luxury to consider Duque's position. His boss's boss, the Lich King Zul, had allowed him to borrow the dark power of the Scourge army. This definitely wasn't without a price. This was an enormous dark power that could temporarily suppress the entire branch of the Sunwell. Even if Antonidas was just a transit point, it was still difficult for him. It was just a swimming pool, but it had to contain an entire lake's worth of water. Even if it was only temporary, the entire pool might rot if things went wrong. Antonidas could only abandon all distracting thoughts and focus on shaping his mana before throwing it at Duque. If one were to ask what was the greatest difference between two veteran Breaking Dawns? Anastrian gave Duque the feeling that he was a cannon of the largest caliber. Every move he made was earth-shattering. Antonidas, on the other hand, was like an unimaginable encyclopedia of magic. Almost all the magic that was mentioned in the textbooks, or the unpopular secret techniques, could be seen in his hands. He was not casting the spell on his own. Since he was a great lich, he had the means of a great lich. After a series of strange and dark spells, delicate but terrifying faces appeared on Antonidas' shoulder ornaments, arm guards, and robes. They were the faces of the High Elven mages. Duque suddenly understood why a few members of the Silver Moon Parliament and a large number of court masters of the Sun-Chasing King Court were missing from the Sun King's side just now. So they were all here, in the form of imprisoned and painful souls. Every face seemed to be struggling to get away from Antonidas. They were destined to fail. That was the darkest and most depraved magic. Their souls had already been firmly bound. Their eyelids could be seen on every face, their eyelids sewn shut by rough rune threads. Unable to open his eyes and unable to break free, he could only rely on his remaining mouth to scream and vent his pain. Soon, under Antonida's spell, their will was suppressed, and nearly 10 mouths began to chant at the same time. In an instant it was no longer limited to ice wolves, but all kinds of magic. In the distance, countless water elementals with inverted triangles stood at the end of the horizon like trees. Without legs, they were still silent even when moving at high speed. The whole army was silent like a monstrous water wall that slowly pressed down on Duque. That was the Water Elemental Legion. Antonidas had never liked fire magic, but it did not mean that he did not know how to use it. A high elf's face glowed with fire, and he finished chanting the last incantation. Then, brilliant flames poured down from the void. 1, 2, dozens of golden rivers of flames hung upside down on the dome. Immediately, they formed a whirling fire tornado, sweeping from behind Duque. Spreading along the tornado were flames that scorched the ground. The sand on the beach that was touched made sizzling sounds, and the ultra-high temperature completely melted the sand, forming a translucent, glass-like molten substance, flaming storm. Before the previous 2 group magic attacks arrived, a powerful direct attack spell was indispensable. Countless dazzling purple-blue lights streaked across the sky like a meteor shower, directly hitting the place where Duque was, super arcane barrage. Antonidas raised his black skull staff, and a pitch-black light curtain immediately rose behind him. Shadows floated on the light curtain, emitting an ominous aura of decay. At the same time, black, translucent skeletal hands appeared around him. The next moment, all the spiritual skeletal hands disappeared, and when they reappeared, they were already within a radius of less than 20 meters around Duque. On each skeletal hand, a black index finger pointed at Duque, and rays of terrifying black spiritual light instantly crossed space and landed on Duque's body, curse of the 12 movements of dusk. Also, more than 100 flaming hands rose in unison, releasing destructive flames toward Duque, 100 hands sacrifice. Suddenly, disgusting barks came from the distance. A moment later, countless dog-like monsters on the beach approached Duque at an alarming speed, one after another, echoing each other in unison. In just the blink of an eye, the hellhounds with red and black stripes, 2 ridiculous black beards and 2 white horns appeared. The ground began to tremble, and it was even more shocking than 10,000 horses galloping. This was a wizard's nightmare, group summoned Cerberus. Apart from these, there were many more, wizards' ice, fire, and arcane spells, warlocks' pain, destruction, and demonic spells. Antonidas used the enslaved radiant moon wizard's souls to unleash all his breaking dawn spells in one go. At this moment, all the mortals who witnessed this scene cried out in shock. Gina Goldsword covered her mouth. Krasis tried to help Duque, but when he transformed into his dragon form again, he was held back. Gina could no longer care about holding back. She directly used one of her trump cards, a few magic tools. The magic sealed in the tools sent a Kirin Tor counselor in front of her flying. But just as she flashed over, she was surrounded by several extremely powerful 3-headed Cerberus, unable to advance an inch. Servanas knocked his bow and shot a rain of arrows at the main battlefield. Unfortunately, it was like trying to put out a burning cart of firewood with a cup of water. Everyone thought that Duque was in trouble, but at this moment, an absolutely confident smile appeared on Duque's face. "Hey, old friend. If I really go all out, you might kneel." Chapter 8:11. Duque didn't hide his methods. The experienced Antonidas also saw what Duque's trump card was. Unfortunately, the most helpless and desperate thing in the world was not knowing what the enemy was doing to you, but knowing what the enemy was going to do to you, but you couldn't stop it. If you didn't know what the enemy was up to, you could still comfort yourself by saying that you were careless and made a mistake. The other party had crushed you fair and square. This was the most intense sense of defeat in the truest sense of the word. Duque made his move. It wasn't his hand. There were strange cries of "oh la 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 la," magician's hand, kept appearing around Duke's body before disappearing again and again. Accompanying this process was the magic circle that appeared out of thin air and floated around Duke's body. Almost every magic array disappeared in a flash. They were as bright as fireworks and as short as shooting stars. However, the destruction of each mage hand and magic array would definitely cause one of Antonida's spells to collapse. A group of 12 mage hands collapsed. Then, the white circle of ice crystals around Antonida's disappeared for some reason and then appeared around Duque. Gina Goldsword's bright pupils suddenly constricted, and she couldn't help but cry out, "Spell steal." Spell steal, as the name suggested, was to transfer beneficial spells from the enemy to oneself or the nearby enemy units. It could also transfer harmful magic effects from the enemy to the nearby enemy units. It sounded like this move could benefit oneself at the expense of others. It was very powerful and high-end. In fact, the more advanced the mage was, the more difficult it was to use this move. It was not easy to steal other people's spells in the first place. Moreover, different mages of magic circuits had different specializations and enhancements. Plus, the source of magic power that supported the buff spell was different. If one was not careful, the buff effect could be stolen at any time, and it could become a poison to oneself. If one was slightly better, it could easily disrupt one's rhythm and break the circulation efficiency of one's magic circuit. Therefore, this move was not as good as others thought. Duque. Are you crazy? Did you really change your class? Antonida's mouth was so wide open that a duck's egg could be stuffed in it. Considering his rotting joints, the others were really worried if he could close his mouth after opening it wide. Right. Apart from ordinary mages, normally, only one class could do this perfectly. If they were not sure at first, what happened next immediately made every knowledgeable senior mage more certain of their judgment. 100 hands sacrificial, flame was like using a match to start a fire in the middle of a freezing winter. The flame was extinguished as soon as it appeared. When the super arcane barrage was 10 meters away from Duke, it disappeared like raindrops falling onto the surface of a lake after a series of ripples appeared. It was the Curse of the 12 Movements of Dusk, which was the most terrifying name for mages. The black smoke of the curse had clearly attached itself to Duke's body, but after being hit, all the curses were like stones sinking into the sea, never to be heard again. Krasis' huge dragon mouth finally spat out a few unbelievable words. It's actually, magic immunity sounded amazing, but in fact, for a mage, it was not necessarily a good thing. Magic immunity was nothing more than a magic defense system that rejected certain elements with superb skills. But if you were immune, it meant that even you could not use this element. Now, Duque actually eliminated fire and arcane in one go, and used a certain method to resist the curse of pain. As a normal mage, the only elemental element he could use was the frost element. Antonidas had been famous for his frost since he was young. Could it be that Duque wanted to fight this veteran, Breaking Dawn, in the field that he was best at? Then, something happened that made everyone's eyeballs fall to the ground. This time, 512 magic hands and their corresponding magic arrays exploded at the same time. In the next moment, the aggressive hellhounds and the water elemental army actually turned around at the same time. Faint golden halos lingered on their foreheads, and it felt as ridiculous as forcing demons to play the role of angels. Unfortunately, their attacks were not laughable. The hellhounds' continuous silence, and the water elemental's magnificent frost arrow rain, caused Antonidas to be flustered. That's right, low-level mysteries were destined to be unable to shake high-level mysteries. But these hellhounds were summoned by Antonidas with his Breaking Dawn magic power, and they were of a relatively high rank. although their silence could not stop Antonidas's every spell. Just as the Great Lich was busy increasing the variety of spells to avoid Duque's interference, this undoubtedly added fuel to the fire. Summon counter control? Antonidas finally could not help but curse. Duque, you lunatic. You clearly had hopes of breaking through to Breaking Dawn. You actually went to become a spellbreaker? Yes. A spellbreaker. A special profession that specialized in destruction and distortion of magical energy. Specializing in magic steel, magic immunity, and summon counter control, were enough for spellbreakers to completely suppress mages of the same rank. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were the bane of mages. But this was not without a price. Disrupting the enemy's magical energy and distorting their magic circuits, as an existence that broke order, they would definitely suffer the backlash of the chaotic power. Why had Kuel Salus never reached a higher rank even though he specialized in nurturing spellbreakers? It was because spellbreakers could not withstand the backlash of magic power, and would collapse before their magic circuits reached a higher rank. Moreover, the more techniques the spellbreaker used, the faster the spellbreaker's strength would decline. That was why Duque, a peak Radiant Moon Great Wizard, had gone to train as a spellbreaker. In the eyes of most mages, this was putting the cart before the horse. Spellbreakers could at most attack half a rank higher. For example, as a peak Radiant Moon, Duque could barely destroy the spells of a rank 5 or 6 Breaking Dawn wizard. It was no wonder that Antonidas had gone crazy. How much hatred do you have for me? Is it necessary to specially train spellbreakers to deal with me? Or did I accidentally get caught in the crossfire? Facing Antonidas' accusation, Duque smiled. Beneath his feet, the power of the Sunwell had been greatly suppressed by the Lich King's power of darkness. After all, Zul was so far away from no scent, and the power here decreased with each use, but the Sunwell branch he controlled had an endless supply. Chapter 8:12. Now that Antonidas, the transfer station of magic power, was suppressed, Duque could use more magic power. He stood with his hands behind his back. As he walked, the volcano under his feet slowly rose, forming a path of lava that led to Antonidas. However, under Duque's feet, every drop of fire element automatically separated. When Duque's feet landed, the lava automatically cooled down to a normal temperature, allowing Duque's feet to step on it. Around Duque, the smoke of the magic war grew more and more intense. Antonidas kept coming up with more types of magic, some of which only existed in legends. Not to mention a young mage like Jaina, even Krasis, who had lived for thousands of years, looked as if he had seen a ghost. Even though he had the encyclopedia of Red Dragon magic, he had only heard of many spells before. Even more terrifyingly, even though it was a spell that nobody had seen before, Duque merely glanced at it and paused for half a second, before a corresponding magic hand appeared in the void with a brand new magic array and cancelled Antonidas' spell. Every senior rank mage who witnessed that scene was at a loss. They mumbled to themselves, "That's impossible, chaos and order had been opposing each other since ancient times. Those who created chaos would be harmed by chaos. That should have been an unbreakable truth." But what did they see now? Anyone with enough magic knowledge could tell that Duque had created a temporary magic circuit outside his body and used it to push a brand new magic array to resist and counteract Antonidas' spell. When the magic array cancelled out the opponent's spell, all the magic backlashes would be borne by the temporary magic circuit. Be it chaos, shattering, or collapsing, all the damage stopped outside of Duque's body. It couldn't cause any damage to Duque himself. Besides, even the magic power to create the temporary magic circuit and the new magic array was provided by the branch of magic power in the Well of the Sun. Duque had completely gained something without risking anything. No. If there was anything Duque had to pay for, it would be his astonishing knowledge and inhuman reaction speed. Since ancient times, the birth of every magic was accompanied by countless painful experiments. The more powerful a spell was, the higher the price it had to pay. Even Breaking Dawn mages would have to kneel if they tried to analyze an ancient spell when their legacies had been severed. Not to mention researching a disruptive spell to counter this rare spell. At this moment, it was a situation that made Antonida's and all the witnesses break down. Antonida's spells in all magic domains were countered. At some point, the battles between the Radiant Moons had come to a halt. Both sides retreated with a clear distinction. They had a tacit understanding of each other after fighting for so long. Given the current situation, it was impossible to bypass the other party and interfere with the duel between Breaking Dawn wizards. On the other hand, once a victor was decided, the enemy's forces at or below the Radiant Moon level would definitely crumble. Rather than spending a great deal of effort and still not being able to affect the outcome of the battle, why not save it for later? Krasis took a deep breath as if he was about to unleash a dragon's breath. The only explanation now is that Duke has read all the magic books in Karazhan and prepared a counterspell for every spell recorded in them, he said in a rumbling voice, as if he was about to unleash a dragon's breath. That's impossible. How old is he? Gina Goldsword cried out in shock. She could not be blamed for crying out. High elves had extremely long lifespans. She had been unhappy with the decadent atmosphere of the Silvermoon Parliament. After reaching the Radiant Moon realm and discovering that they could not advance to the Breaking Dawn realm, they decisively led a befuddled life and did not seek to improve. That was why she had left Kuel Salis and wandered the continent. There had been a period of time when she had been a member of the Dalajan Kirin Tor Parliament. It was to borrow the Dalajan's books legally. However, it had taken her 3,000 years to read all 100,000 magic books. With her achievements, it was enough for her to be proud to call herself a polymath. It was not impossible to create a counterspell for the spells in the books. But it was definitely not so fast, so accurate, and so perfect. The problem was that now, what Duque had done had subverted all her common sense. Beside her, Gina calmed her rapid breathing from the fierce battle and recalled bits and pieces of Duque. She suddenly smiled bitterly. Duque is a Superman who can use 100 magic hands to flip through a report and 100 magic eyes to read a report at the same time. Gina's words almost choked the surrounding archmages to death. That's right, this was not something that could be done in a day and a half. As early as the second battle at the Dark Portal, there was an exaggerated feat of Duque single-handedly taking care of the logistics of the entire alliance. Unexpectedly, after more than 10 years, this godly skill of Duque seemed to have become even more amazing. Just thinking about it made the bystanders feel like they were going to collapse. How big was the Karazhan library? According to Gina's memories, even if they didn't count the well-hidden secret and forbidden books, there were more than 1 million books outside. If it were an ordinary human mage, even if they died reading here, it would be impressive if they could read through 10,000 books in their lifetime. Everyone only knew that Duque was different from them. But they couldn't dissect Duque. For Duque, as long as he scanned every page of any book, it would automatically form an identical magic book in the system library. It wasn't as simple as just recording. When Duque's brain was idle, the system elf would also borrow Duque's brainpower to analyze all the spells in the magic books, deducing, simplifying, condensing, and marking out the flaws and developing counterspells on his own. In the memories of the years when Gina was studying under Duque, Duque was often like an ignorant and incompetent book-flipping criminal. Walking to a bookshelf, regardless of what book it was, with a snap of his fingers, from bottom to top, he used the hand of magic to flip through the books in order, flipped them once, and then put them back. The only difference was that at that time, there were at most 10 hands of magic and eyes of magic working. At that time, Duque didn't look like he was reading at all, but flipping through the books to see if there would be anything like golden leaves in them. Jaina would never have thought that Duque, with the help of the system elf, was studying magic books at a speed 100 times faster than a normal person 24 hours a day. Studying while eating. Studying while drinking water. Summarizing while sleeping. Even when they were having sex, the system elf also faithfully helped Duque categorize and summarize magic knowledge. That was why there was this incomparably terrifying Duque now. As long as there was enough magic power. Duque was the god of magic. Magic exploded between Duque and Antonidas like brilliant fireworks, then dissipated with the wind. Before he knew it, Duque had walked to 10 meters in front of the Great Lich. Duque's lips curled into a smile. Spellbreaker? Who said I was a spellbreaker? I'm just a spellbreaker in the world. Chapter 8:13. Unbreakable? Duque's voice spread far and wide. If Duque hadn't destroyed all the spells that were known as the Encyclopedia of Magic in front of 200,000 people. If Duque hadn't been the most powerful wizard in the Alliance who'd become a Breaking Dawn long ago. If Duque's opponent hadn't been the Great Lich Antonidas, who was also a Breaking Dawn. If Duque didn't turn the tide time and time again under the crisis, Duque's seemingly boastful words were enough to make all the pharaohs in the world curse Duque and scold Duque. But now, in the face of absolute battle achievements, no one cared if you were a fake Breaking Dawn. Everyone could see Duque beating up the Sun King, an Astrian Sunstrider, and now Antonidas, who was also a Breaking Dawn, being ruthlessly suppressed. The reason why a legendary hero could become a legend was not only because of his shocking achievements, but also because of rumors and exaggerations. One had to be strong to forge iron, but without advertising, who would know if one was strong enough? Duque was closing in on Antonidas step by step. This was an imminent threat to the Great Lich, but from another perspective, it was also an opportunity. Evidently, as Antonidas continued to throw out new spells, Duque had less time to break them, and the situation became more dangerous. Both of them had immense magic power. One was the power of darkness, while the other was the power of light, the power of the sun. For a moment, the elemental turbulence around the two combatants grew more and more violent due to the intense explosions. It was like a raging storm. Duque, you clearly had such strength, so why didn't you use it at the start? Why did you have to wait until I fell before using it? Why did you make me so ugly? From Antonidas' tone, it seemed like he was blaming his fall on Duque. Looking at the Great Lich, Duque couldn't help but recall the extremely conservative policies Antonidas had adopted in the past decade. Sigh. It's exactly because you've become so stubborn and arrogant that this has happened. Duque shrugged. You couldn't defeat a dreadlord in a one-on-one fight, and you were even killed by a trap set up by the enemy. So you're blaming me? You. Antonidas uttered the word, you, 3 times in a row. His cloudy eyeball looked like it was going to fall out of his rotten skull at any time. Duque's facial muscles twitched as he cursed in his heart, that's why I hate liches. They affect the city too much. Whether Antonidas liked it or not, he was now immortal. Unlike Servanas, who had become the undead queen in history, it was understandable that he, who had taken the path of a lich, had given up on himself because of his disfigurement. Understanding was not the same as understanding. Their different standpoints meant that the two of them would not let each other go. No one could turn back now. Just as Duque expected, Antonidas was like a giant beast that devoured the heavens and earth. After swallowing a huge amount of dark force, he finally released his ultimate move. Suddenly, a majestic and cold aura spread across the entire world, as if winter had suddenly descended. The endless chill spread in all directions with the Great Lich as the center. In the blink of an eye, there was no longer a boundary between heaven and earth. The gray sky disappeared. The Isle of Quel Danas, where even the sand was emitting a faint sunlight, also disappeared. The entire world was only left with a gloomy white. It was the plains of death covered in ice and snow. It had to be said that Antonidas, who had started his career playing frost magic, seemed to be fated with the Lich King. However, Duque still had an undisguised look of surprise on his face. According to the system notification, Antonidas had injected more than 80% of his soul into this gray and white world. It was not unusual for any demigod to use a huge amount of magic as energy and his own soul to build an imaginary domain world. In the realm of demigods, some demigods like to strengthen their bodies to the extreme, while others like to use their domain world to suppress their enemies. For example, the Queen of Dreams, Isra, walked the path of becoming one with her domain world. As long as she was in the dream world, she was the strongest. She was the Emerald Dream, and the Emerald Dream was her. Once her main body or the Emerald Dream was corrupted, she would be finished. It was obvious that Antonidas had chosen the same path as Isra. What a pity, Duque felt that it was a pity. It was a pity that Antonidas had used it at the wrong time. If Antonidas had been a peak-breaking dawn and was about to break through, he might have been able to break through the breaking dawn bottleneck and become a demigod after borrowing the Lich King's dark force. But now, a certain someone had shamelessly taken away many of his magic circuits, and his newly created magic circuits had yet to be completely stabilized. In addition, his strength was far from the semi-god level. If he brazenly unleashed a domain that he was unfamiliar with, it would undoubtedly be destroying his own future. This might be the only chance in his life for him to step into the realm of domain world. From then on, because of the damage to his soul, this once unparalleled human great wizard, no matter what form he existed in the world, had no room for growth. It was not that Antonidas did not hesitate, he was not so decisive, and he was not fanatically loyal to the Lich King. He was purely treated as an abandoned pawn by Zul. Yes. In a sense, Zul did not lack Lich fighters. Now he had Anastrian, the resurrected Kel Thuzad, and Antonidas under him. In terms of loyalty, Antonidas could not compare to Kel Thuzad, who was like-minded with the Lich King. In terms of strength, Anastrian was actually a head above Olden. If the price of Antonidas not being able to advance again in the future was to eliminate a great enemy like Duque, then it was really worth it. Duque could not help but sigh. As expected, once one's strength weakened, it would not end well. Antonidas pulled him into the icy plains of death. In his domain, other than what Duque had, all external forces were isolated. Duque's biggest problem was undoubtedly that he could no longer borrow elemental power from the outside world. Of course, this included the most important magic power of the Sunwell branch. Although Antonidas might not be able to maintain the domain for a long time, it was still quite fatal to Duque. After all, after losing the help of external forces, Duque immediately returned to his original form, becoming the pharaoh whose magic power was only at the peak of the Radiant Moon realm. It had to be said that Antonidas was a veteran powerhouse who had experienced hundreds of battles. Although the older he got, the more extreme he became, and he once lost his soul and had his soul captured, his sensitivity and judgment towards magic battles were still as good as before. He immediately grasped Duque's weakest link. Chapter 8:14. In the endless snowfield of death, Duque's figure was so lonely and helpless. The aura of the Alliance commander and the glory of the legendary hero seemed to have faded at this moment. Duque could only rely on himself. Duque. Duke Marcus. Are you still going to struggle in vain? What's the point of your resistance in the face of the mighty power of the Lich King? Antonidas' voice echoed in the entire white world. His loud voice made Duque's eardrums hurt. F***ck, aren't you the underling of someone else's underling? Even you, Zul, have to kneel in front of me. What are you pretending to be? Duque couldn't help but complain. Suddenly, the clouds in the sky were so thick that they were almost solid. Obviously, Antonidas, who had turned himself into the world, had a dark expression on his face. Although he didn't like looking up, Duque still looked up at the sky. He looked at the world as if he was looking at Antonidas. Suddenly, Duque felt a little pity for this former elder of the Alliance. Duque was not a saint. It was impossible for him to save everyone in front of the aggressive dark forces, especially when fate had changed dramatically. Compared to the current fallen Antonidas, the original ending of being killed by Arthas and directly becoming a ghost wandering in the ruins of the Dalajan seemed a little more glorious. Alas! Duque sighed. If Antonidas fought him in a place far away from the Well of the Sun, or outside of the domain, he would naturally be beaten like a dog. After losing his life, Duque might not even be able to escape with his soul. Why did Antonidas have to drag him into an immature field? If this was a domain that had been truly tempered and condensed after continuous improvement, it could only belong to Antonidas. Perhaps this time, it would be Duque who would kneel. This domain, on the surface, maximized his ice magic and completely rejected all power except ice and death. In fact, this world was not Antonidas' home field in the real sense. This was a domain that the Lich King, Zul, had used Antonidas as a medium to weave the laws of the Lich King. Antonidas. Duque could not help but sigh, his eyes filled with pity. What? The veteran Breaking Dawn Great Wizard was startled, his face full of vigilance. Then he saw Duque's gaze change. It became cold and mechanical. He didn't know what it was. If he knew, he would have stopped Duque immediately. At this moment, there were many green dots of light pouring down from top to bottom in Duque's retina. This was naturally the data provided by the system elf, who had completely fused with Duque's soul. After the system's transformation, the entire domain world was no longer what it looked like with the naked eye. It was a digitized world made up of countless zeros and ones. In this world that had been completely transformed into binary, every bit of Antonidas's magic flow could not be hidden from Duque's eyes that had been strengthened by the system. Duque spoke, his voice low and full of regret. We could have been friends despite the difference in age, but every time, you treat my help as a deal. So, you don't owe me anything, and I don't owe you anything. Let me end this. As he spoke, Duque slowly raised his arm and stretched out his palm towards the void. His clenched palm was clearly grabbing the air in front of him, but in an inconspicuous void in the distance, there was something that had the same shape as Duque's hand. Antonidas condensed his face in mid-air, and one could clearly see that the old Lich's eyeballs almost popped out of their sockets. There was indescribable horror in his voice. This is impossible. How did you know? The corners of Duque's mouth curled up slightly. Actually, you're the inexperienced one. You shouldn't have used your magic circuit model to create this domain. Because you were afraid that you couldn't withstand the dark power that Zul had gathered for you, the first thing you thought of was to use the circuit you were most familiar with as a foundation. But you couldn't have. Duque raised his left hand and shook it proudly. Have you forgotten? 14 years ago, it was you who personally gave me the prototype of the Arcane Throne, and the Crown of Ice, magic circuit. Since I used the same circuit prototype as you, how could I not have studied where it was easiest to destroy? Bastard! Antonidas was exasperated. He roared and immediately set off a wild wave. He was about to drown Duque with absolute dark power. But time suddenly seemed to freeze in the entire space. Because the old Lich saw Duque take out a round, egg-sized scale that emitted a red light. This was a treasure that Duque had spent 81 times to exchange for from the hands of a certain giant dragon imperial sister with great difficulty. Although it was accidentally knocked off by a certain dragon thousands of years ago, and new scales had already grown, how could something that belonged to a dragon aspect be worthless? Scale of life, a dragon's scale that contained the high heat and strong vitality of a dragon's breath. Under normal circumstances, this was just a good epic item. But for the Calamity Army, which specialized in coldness and death, this was a super-killing weapon that was no less than a divine artifact. In such an occasion, the lethality was definitely on the level of a nuclear bomb. And now, he was going to give it to Antonidas as a gift. No, this is impossible. Antonidas could hardly believe what he saw. When Duque rushed back, even Lordaeron had not fallen. Could it be that he had already foreseen the fall of Arthas, and had asked Alexstrasza to prepare a treasure to deal with the Calamity Army? How could there be such a coincidence in this world? Or could it be that all the mages of the Mediv had the ability to prophesy? Antonidas would never have thought that Duque was a super troublemaker from another world. Antonidas was on the verge of a mental breakdown. His domain was clearly his home field. In this world created by his power, he should have the absolute advantage. Why did it seem like he had sent his phylactery to Duque's hammer and let Duque smash it? But this was not entirely his world, and he could not control it at all. As the dark power continuously flowed into his soul, he could not even stop it. No, the great lich let out a scream. Duque sighed and shook his head. He flicked his finger and the dragon scale to a place where 36 magic circuits converged. It's over, Antonidas. Chapter 8:15. Arg! Antonidas let out an earth-shattering scream. The entire world was like a living person getting goosebumps. Immediately, countless bumps that made people shudder appeared, as though something was about to explode and erupt. Arg! Antonidas' original form screamed as he appeared in this world. Although he had hidden himself a long time ago, any place that dealt with the most power of darkness would definitely have the core of his soul. After knowing this, under the scanning of the system elf, the pitiful great lich had nowhere to hide. Without the sage-like appearance of an old wizard with fluttering white hair and beard, and without the aura of a supreme being who commanded thousands of men and horses, Antonidas, who had lost all external disguises, looked no different from a ghoul hugging its head and curling up into a ball. Duque's scale of life did not just destroy the main vein of this domain world, but also the order of this world. The overly concentrated power of darkness rampaged in his soul, as though it would explode at any moment. At the very end, he stood up straight, his body trembling as though there were whips lashing at him every moment. If Duque's guess was right, this was a punishment from the soul. Antonidas' voice trembled, but there was a sense of tranquility. Duque. I've made many mistakes in my life. But my greatest honor is to have once created a prosperous Dalajan. On account of the time we fought side by side, please promise me to revive the Dalajan. Finally, please give me a quick death. I don't want to return to the throne of Zul. Duque was a little surprised. Not every soul was named Uther or Bolvar, and could resist the terrifying pressure of the Lich King. Although he did not think that Antonidas had such willpower and boldness, which could be seen from the old wizard's fall, he really did not think that the old wizard would be able to break free from the Lich King's soul shackles at the last moment of his collapse. This made Duque inexplicably feel more respect for the veteran Breaking Dawn wizard who had ruled the Dalajan for nearly 50 years. Good. I promise you, I will revive the Dalajan. Just as I did with Stormwind. An expression of relief appeared on Antonidas's withered face, which was unique to a lich. In Duque's green world that had been digitally altered by a sea of zeros and ones, he could clearly see that Antonidas was collecting all the pieces of his soul into this body. In his field of vision, Antonidas's face quickly changed back to the appearance of a living person, that wise elder with white hair and a white beard. At this time, Zul's sharp and exasperated voice came from the void, "No. Antonidas. Your soul belongs to me. You have no right to deal with your own soul." Antonidas was anxious. Duque. Hurry up and move. Even if I only have 10% of my soul left, Azul can still forcefully resurrect me and force me to serve him. Duque's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Without hesitation, a golden shadow suddenly rushed out from Duque's body. It was an illusion that was identical to Duque's real body. The biggest difference between it and Duque's real body was that it emitted an incomparably holy aura. Between the index and middle fingers of its right hand was a coin. In the next moment, the coin turned into a standard cross sword that knights loved to use. The cross sword emitted a golden light and pierced into Antonidas's forehead like lightning. This sword? Antonidas's expression suddenly changed, and a smile of relief appeared on his face. A voice floated into Duque's soul. Thank you, Duque. In the Dalajan, 300 meters below my wizard tower, there is my last treasure. The password is to connect my 2 magic circuits with my real name. Duque's whole body trembled. He really did not think that after killing Antonidas, there would be such extra equipment. Duque saw that a large number of zeros and ones around him were speeding up the separation. Antonidas's elemental power was disintegrating. In just a few seconds, the snow-white world supported by the dark power quickly faded, and the periphery gradually returned to the seaside scenery on the Isle of Quel Danas. It's Duque. Sylvanas was the first to see the figure inside clearly. Her heart failed to live up to her expectations and started beating wildly. Immediately, there was a burst of screams from the crowd. They did not think that the battle between the two would be so terrifying. The huge dark power turned into a huge cocoon with a diameter of a kilometer, tightly wrapping the two people. No outsider would be able to get involved. He had thought that this would be an evenly matched battle that would drag on for a long time. Who would have thought that in less than 3 minutes, the winner would be decided? Duque thrust his sword forward, and the illusory blade of the golden cross sword was like a burning golden flame, directly igniting the old lich's body. The long sword that was like a holy sword pierced through the great lich's head and rapidly melted his soul. This scene, in the eyes of the 200,000 soldiers, was like an apostle of God using supreme divine power to punish the evil fallen. Everyone's expression was gone, leaving only a look of disbelief. Saint Duque, oh my God! It really is Saint Duque. The people unconsciously murmured, reciting the nickname of Duque when he revived Stormwind and saved the people with supreme wisdom and internal power. That's right. Saint Duque. The legendary name that was transmitted by every bard shone again at this moment. Not only were the humans and a few dwarves shouting, but Theron even found that many elves were also shouting Duque's holy name. On the other side, after Duque's golden illusion stabbed the sword, Antonidas's withered body trembled violently. When Duque's illusion pulled out the golden sword of holy light, the illusion disappeared. Duque put his hands behind his back, stepped on the sand, and walked to the side of the former chairman of the Kirin Tor. This once famous mage leader could no longer maintain the illusory appearance of an old mage, and had returned to the form of a lich. Duque looked at Antonidas's turbid eyes. At this moment, he could not even feel the joy of victory in his heart. He only asked calmly, "Is this okay?" The great lich's throat gurgled, but in the end, it seemed that because his vocal cords had decayed for too long, he still could not make a sound. At this moment when his soul was beginning to collapse, further emotional expression seemed to be an extravagant hope. Looking at him, Duque could not help but show a trace of sadness in his eyes. In his impression, there did not seem to be a good ending for fallen people. Duque took one last look at the sad old mage and turned to leave. But this former supreme ruler of the Dalajan was like the last radiance of the setting sun. His body trembled violently, and then there was a whisper in the wind. It was a sound that Antonidas had recalled thousands of times, and who knew how many times he tried to control his throat to squeeze out a sound. "Thank you," that was a human, not an undead, expressing his gratitude at the end of his life. Duque stopped and replied softly, "You're welcome." Chapter 8:16. Antonida's final expression was fixed on a peaceful smile. As a lich, even a smile was terrifying, but he was indeed smiling from the bottom of his heart. His dry throat made unintelligible noises. He reached out his withered hand as if trying to grab something. Was it his lost youth? Or was it the glory of being a human? This, perhaps, would forever be a mystery. His soul disintegrated, and the last power that drove the decaying body also disappeared. The sea breeze blew, and the once famous mage leader's body was like a sand castle blown away by the wind, turning into sand and dissipating with the wind. Duque looked at the coin floating in his hand, a little stunned. This was a gift of moral integrity that Archbishop Alonso's fail had left him. A long time ago in the Dalajan, a Lordaeran missionary threw a copper coin into the fountain and made a wish. "I hope that one day, I can spread the way of holy light to the commoners, and teach them the meaning of the three great virtues." After Alonso's passed away, the sole coin that was passed on to Duque was the condensed divine will in Duque's hand. After receiving Duque's permission, it merged with Duque's soul. With the truth, beauty, and all the righteous will around Duque as nourishment, this soul coin had become shining, full of holy aura. Duque did not notice the gazes of the pastors in the army of 200,000 soldiers. Not to mention Sally Whitemane, a young girl who had just touched the way of holy light. Even a bishop like Benedicta had a look of yearning. Duque finally seemed to notice the burning gazes of the crowd. He laughed at himself. If I can't continue on the path of the pharaoh in the future, can I still go to the church and give some pointers to the female pastors?" Just when everything seemed to have come to an end, the Lich King Zul's will condensed into a huge, icy blue skull in the air. This was a terrifying virtual image with a diameter of over 100 meters. It exuded an evil black spirit light and a terrifying aura that caused the temperature to plummet. Every living being that witnessed this could not help but feel as if a huge rock was pressing down on their hearts. They felt like they could not breathe. Oh my God! He had already killed a Breaking Dawn Great Lich. Why were there so many creepy existences in the Calamity Army? Zul roared with all his might, "Duke Marcus, and you lowly humans and elves, do you think this is victory? Do you think I will let you go just like that? No. This was just the beginning. Death will eventually cover every inch of the world of Azeroth." Duque stopped and did not look back. Zul, that's enough. The last time you came to Karazhan, you were blown up by Kill Jaden and only had a soul left. Haven't you suffered enough? How dare you believe the words of Kill Jaden the Deceiver? If the commander of the Burning Legion really succeeds in descending to Azeroth, you, who have no value, will not even be as good as a ghoul. Duque's words were more of a nail in Zul's heart than a spoiler. From the beginning to the end, Zul was not willing to work for Kill Jaden. In the original history, Zul took the opportunity to escape again. Duque was just pretending to make a deduction based on Kill Jaden's character. Suddenly, Zul almost choked to death. You, if there were Kill Jaden's henchmen nearby, Zul might have pretended to shout a few words of "Long live the Burning Legion," to show his loyalty. However, although Zul was afraid of death, his self-esteem was still very strong. After all, he had been a great chieftain and had now named himself the noble filthy goblin king. In front of so many people, Zul would never admit that he was Kill Jaden's dog. After choking for 3 seconds, Zul finally roared, "Duque! You think you're in control of the situation, but you're wrong. I'm telling you, you're definitely a loser this time. You'll never know what my perfect plan is. Even if you have the ability to stop Arthas now, my plan to destroy Azeroth will still not be affected in the slightest. Whether it's humans, dwarves, elves, or any other race, your only fate is to become my slaves after death. The land you cherish will become a rotten land worse than Draenor. Ha ha ha. Ha 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 ha. Duque bared his teeth. Think? Do I still need to think about it? I already know what you're going to do. Zul, are you done with your nonsense? If you're done, then get lost. I used to think that you were trash who only knew how to fart, but now you've actually fallen to become a dog who only knows how to fart. Aren't you ashamed? That's right. The Burning Legion's repeated attacks on Azeroth were almost unstoppable. Even if they could withstand it this time, they could not avoid the next time. Since that was the case, Duque, who was still a transmigrator, was thinking about how to make the Alliance grow faster and how to strengthen himself. Other than saving the High Elves, the next most important thing was of course for the Night Elves to join the Alliance. The Elves were all super conservative, not to mention the Night Elves who were rampant with the Druid doctrine. If the demons did not come to their door, would the Night Elves run out to ask for help? Archimonde's arrival was certainly a tragedy. But protecting the World Tree did not benefit Duze and the Alliance at all. Therefore, Duque had already made up his mind to decisively let the Alliance do nothing before Archimonde killed his way to the World Tree. Of course, there was a large group of the future Alliance's middle power, led by Sylvanas, watching. As the leader of the Alliance, Duque still had to put on an act no matter what. At this moment, Duque's moral integrity was in his body. At this second, Duque's body glowed with a golden light. At this moment, Duque was openly lying. The handsome Duque raised his head and looked at the skeleton in midair. He raised his right hand, and the holy gold coin once again turned into a holy sword. Humph. A 40-meter long sword. Oh, it's a super holy sword. I'm asking you if you're afraid. Duque's words were righteous and overflowing with a noble spirit. Ha! You underestimate the intelligent races of Azeroth. Do you think you can overthrow the entire Azeroth with your lousy plot? Zul, do you want to destroy this world? Have you asked us? With that, Duque turned around and looked at those pairs of burning eyes. Then, he shouted at the Alliance soldiers, human soldiers, this despicable demon in front of us says he wants to kill us all and turn us into this bastard slaves. Do you agree? Chapter 8:17. Tens of thousands of Scarlet Cross elites raised their weapons high and shouted in the loudest voice since the start of the war, no, answer, yes. Duque continued to shout, dwarves and gnome brothers, this guy says he wants to destroy all civilizations. What do you think? Damn it! The violent dwarves raised their war hammers high. Duque finally waved at the elves. This bastard not only destroyed your homes, but he also wants to burn down every last inch of green space and a small tree. What do you think? Sylvanas stood out proudly. For the blood of Quell Dorii. We must take revenge. Who among the High Elves did not know the strength and terror of the enemy? Those who could gather here were naturally the most courageous and unyielding in the entire Elven race. They were the backbone of the future revival of the High Elves and the pillars of the reconstruction of the Elven kingdom. The earth-shattering roars of the humans and the sonorous and powerful shouts of the dwarves deeply stimulated the hearts of these tens of thousands of elves. They thought of their dead relatives and friends, and of their destroyed homes. An unparalleled rage suddenly gushed out from the depths of their hearts and rushed straight to their heads. They abandoned the nobility and restraint that they once boasted about, tore off the mask of gentleness and elegance in front of the world, especially in front of humans, and shouted in unison. Revenge! 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 The morale of the troops could be used. Almost without thinking, Sylvanas, who struck while the iron was hot, suddenly raised his war bow and shouted, "Our kingdom is destroyed. Our city is destroyed. Our compatriots and loved ones are killed. In order for future generations to never forget this day, I announce that Quell Dorii will be renamed to Sin Dorii. Duque could not hide the surprise on his face. Quell, in the elven language of Salis, meant nobility, and Sin meant blood. The High Elves had changed their name from Quell Dorii to Sin Dorii, which was originally done by Kale, that's in history. It had to be said that history was shockingly similar. In a certain scene, under certain circumstances, they would make the same choice. At this moment, in the tens of thousands of elven troops, every elf was full of anger. In their rage, they desperately needed to vent. They did not even notice that Sylvanas, who was technically just a National Salvation Committee and officially a Ranger General, did not have the authority to make such a major decision. One or two of them, tens of thousands of people, were completely enraged by Zul's clamor. Naturally, they agreed to Sylvanas' call. This kind of astonishing momentum. Could it be that after Sylvanas doesn't need to become an undying, God will still send her the throne of Queen? What about the Forsaken? I, Duque, am from the Alliance. Why should I care about the tribe? Alright, since Sylvanas doesn't need to change races and still has the chance to become Queen Sylvanas, I definitely don't mind giving you a push. Duque pursed his lips at Sylvanas and glanced at the Lich King's skull from the corner of his eye. Sylvanas immediately understood. Demon! Get lost! A loud shout rang out. He drew the bow and knocked the arrow in one smooth motion. This was an action that Sylvanas had practiced and used hundreds of thousands of times in actual combat. Each action was unremarkable, but when connected, there was a kind of natural beauty. Looking at her beautiful hair fluttering in the wind and thunder power, her heroic demeanor of a war goddess easily infected every elf. They looked at Sylvanas standing on the hill with reverent and pious gazes. They were looking forward to it and waiting with excitement. They wanted to see Sylvanas, whom they had high hopes for, do something that would make them excited. However, at this moment, Sylvanas was actually dumbfounded. Just now, with a look from Duque, she did not think much about it and knocked the arrow. Of course, she wanted to shoot that hateful skull of Zul with one arrow, but after subconsciously putting the bow and arrow on the posture, she suddenly remembered a serious problem: she did not have the means to deal with enemies with souls. Who knew if lightning could hurt ghosts? If she could not shoot that skull with one arrow, she would really lose face in front of the ancestors of the Dark Elves. Tens of thousands of elves stared at her back with burning eyes. Those tens of thousands of gazes were nothing before, but now they were like tens of thousands of long swords. If she was not careful, she would be pierced by thousands of swords and die. Biting her fiery red lips hard, Sylvanas really wanted to die at this moment. Now it was clear that the arrow had to be shot, but, suddenly, she had a feeling of hating herself and hating Duque to death. It was not good to have such a telepathic connection with anyone, but it had to be with Duque. With a look from him, she foolishly knocked the arrow and aimed at the demon. Now it was all right. What was back field? On the other hand, seeing Sylvanas being so obedient and working with a look from him, and then embarrassed, Duque only felt that it was very interesting and funny. Duque immediately felt Sylvanas' fierce glare. She wanted him to find a way to end this. It had to be said that the three Windrunner sisters' reactions when they were embarrassed were very interesting. Sasha, the most wife-like one, had a soft pleading look in her eyes. Just looking at her made one unable to refuse. Aurelia, the most knowledgeable of the big picture, had a look of, "Little guy, why aren't you coming to help? Don't blame me if the field is ruined," with a look that moved and reasoned with him. Alright, now Sylvanas was even more direct: "Will you help me or not? If you don't blame me for flipping the table." That wildness, that arrogance, also deeply fascinated Duque. Duque smiled lightly. Even though he was more than 100 meters away from her, she still felt Duque's small movements. It was a soul that others could not see with the naked eye, a soul with a powerful holy aura. Only clergymen with the purest hearts, such as little girl Sally Whitemane, could see that a golden soul suddenly flew out of Duque's body and flew behind Sylvanus. At this moment, Sylvanus was in a standard posture of drawing a bow and nocking an arrow. Left leg in front, right leg in back. Left hand holding the bow, right hand pulling the bowstring. Others could not see it, but it did not mean that Sylvanus could not feel it. She only felt a warm soul hugging her from behind. Naturally, that was Duque's soul. This kind of embrace that was filled with ambiguity made Sylvanus flustered. Because his crotch was against her buttocks, his burning right hand lightly rested on her right hand, and his left hand gently stroked her upper left arm all the way to the fingertips of her left hand. If it were someone else, she would definitely have goosebumps all over her body and would have screamed. But that incomparably serene feeling of the warm soul made her feel very good. Chapter 8:18. Sylvanus's heart was tangled at the moment. For the sake of her people's hatred, even if she knew that the Lich King's body was not here, she still hoped to teach the bastard Zul a terrible lesson. On the other hand, she was very familiar with the posture of Duque holding her. When her eldest sister and third sister practiced archery in the elven forest, Duque, the bastard, often harassed her sisters with this posture, saying something about a two-man joint attack. As a result, in the end, he could not help but give a lot of dog food to the one-handed dog. And 8 out of 10 times it would make a lot of pa noise, so Sylvanus, who had sensitive ears and eyes, had to run a few kilometers away. In the past, Sylvanus hated Duque to the core. She did not expect that now she would enjoy this treatment. Duque, the bastard, was still no match. Smooth hand. Sylvanus was going crazy. Of course, she knew why. The 4 Windrunner sisters, except for the youngest Lilith, the first 3 sisters were about the same height. Of course, there was a difference in size, but for Duque, there was no difference. The most confusing thing for Sylvanus was that she used to be very disgusted, and she wanted Duque to get as far away as possible. However, it seemed that after he was saved by Duque in the certain death situation of the sun-chasing royal court, he did not realize that his mentality had changed. Even though she was shy, even though she was a little annoyed, even though the integration at the soul level made her have an illusion of being seen naked, but the feeling was unexpectedly not too bad. She could not accept it from the bottom of her heart, but at least it was not uncomfortable. Clearly, her reason told her that this feeling seemed to be very dangerous, but her heart, her body, and her soul had a sense of anticipation to see what would happen next. Suddenly, the scene of her kissing Duque in a daze came to her mind. Damn it, what's wrong with me? Sylvanus cast a fierce glare at Duque diagonally behind her. Bastard, I will make you pay. Lorthamar and the others heard Sylvanus cursing, but they subconsciously thought that Sylvanus was cursing at the Lich King. It was impossible for a third party to know that she was actually scolding Duque for taking advantage of her. She steadied her footsteps and decided to ignore that bastard Duque. Her eyes were only left with the ferocious and threatening large ice-blue skull in the air. Sylvanus, who put away all distracting thoughts, had a grave expression on his face. His facial lines were taut, silently pursing his lips into a straight line. Zul's noisy threat still echoed over the beach. You mortals have no chance. You will all die. If you don't want your souls to be imprisoned under my throne and tortured for 10,000 years after you die, you'd better join me now. This is the last time I'm persuading you to surrender. Every elf stared at Sylvanus. At some point in time, this ranger general who had once left the elves had become the backbone of the surviving elves. Her every word and action would represent the whole of Sin Dorii. Now, she would take this step. After this step, she would throw the dice that would determine the fate of the entire elven race. Although he had already predicted her choice, no one knew whether the end of this path would lead to victory or destruction after placing the bet. Even so, at this moment, everyone still chose to hand the final decision to Sylvanas. Sylvanas subconsciously looked at the arrow flickering with lightning in his hand. The purplish-blue lightning actually flickered with a faint radiance under the gray and black canopy of necromancy. Every vein on the wooden shaft seemed to be wriggling like a spirit snake. It was time to hand over the answer. At this moment, as the gold coin between the fingers of Duque Divine Soul slid across Sylvanas' arm, a burst of golden light burst from the longbow. The golden radiance extended to that long arrow, but it was wrapped within Sylvanas' purple-blue lightning radiance. On the hill, the elves seemed to hear the sound of a horn in a trance. That was the horn of war. That was the horn of Sin Doriai's revenge on the Scourge army. They took a deep breath. In the next moment, the long sound of the horn of war, which lingered on the beach and drifted between heaven and earth, accompanied by the sound of the bowstring, it officially sounded. A beam of light that represented the hope of the elves, and even the entire alliance, shot from the ground to the sky. It was like a ray of dawn that shone on the earth, breaking through the darkness and breaking through the dark clouds. At the same time, it shot the illusory skull that no longer had the support of the power of darkness. This arrow was like a signal flare. Then, Dooku raised his arms high and allowed the mana from the Sun-Well Branch Meridian to gush out towards the sky. Previously, the arrow had only shot a hole in the cold, dark clouds. Now, the energy of the Sunwell that Duque had activated was like a pair of incomparably huge hands that tore apart the dark sky and tore it apart. Long live the Alliance! Without needing Duque to give the order, Mograine immediately understood. He raised the Ashbringer in his hand high up. Under the guidance of this holy sword that emitted an even stronger holy light, more than 200,000 troops spread out from the entire Isle of Quell, Donnas and rushed towards the Sunwell Highland where the Sunwell was. They had thought that after the Lich King extracted a large amount of soul energy from the undead creatures, there would be no more resistance on the island. But obviously, this thought was wrong. Indeed, after Duque killed Antonidas, the power of darkness that the Lich King had injected into the Great Lich's temporary territory had collapsed. However, with the Lich King personally taking action, the remaining power of darkness was once again scattered in all directions. Not only were the High Elves that originally guarded the island resurrected as undead, but due to the quality of these elite guards, many of them directly became Death Knights. To make matters worse, the Burning Legion seemed to have started to interfere. The sky began to rain, a green meteor shower. When they saw huge rocks wrapped in green flames falling from the sky, they first blasted a huge pit in the ground, then turned into human-shaped stone giants that were more than 10 meters tall and crawled out to attack the Alliance soldiers. A distant memory surfaced in everyone's mind. The veterans and generals who had experienced the second battle at the Dark Portal were no strangers to this scene. It was a huge demon summoned by a warlock, Hellfire. Such a terrifying demon was not something that could be defeated by conventional means. The most effective way to fight against Hellfire was holy light, followed by magic. However, the hundreds of Hellfires that should have become the new focus of the entire battlefield were quickly ignored by the Alliance soldiers. This was because a huge black pillar of light suddenly rose from the Sunwell in the north. Everyone could clearly feel an evil will rising. It was the rebirth of a great lich. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.